IskatuMesk is a veteran designer, modder, and commentator with a vast back catalog of projects, ranging from Let's Plays and developer series to total conversions and custom games. IskatuMesk, welcome to the No Frauds Club, a place where you already are very familiar with. And for the first question of today's interview, I wanted to ask you about something that I think is a one way to describe you, especially for people who aren't familiar with your work, is that you operate on what I would describe as the frontier of thoughts when it comes to game design. There's not a lot of people I've met or I've consumed the content of that have anywhere close to the same kinds of ideas. And I wanted to start by asking you about how those ideas get developed, how you start to think about those things. Maybe it'll just be really mundane for you because maybe it's something you haven't really considered too much. But when I think about some of the contributions you've made to my thought basis and my thought pool, if you will, one of the things that keeps coming up is that you have these formed opinions of, like, usually based around interaction. So a concrete example would be when I asked you about upgrades in RTS games in one of the later episodes of a podcast we had done together a while ago. You mentioned that upgrades were fire and forget, and then there's like not much interaction once you get them, and so they don't matter. And that was a thought that just hadn't occurred to me personally. And so that got me thinking when the time came to do this, is that that's something that comes up all the time with you, is that you have these ideas that I don't see talked about anywhere else. And in that way, it's almost like you know, I don't know. There's an element of it where it could be considered like your progeny of ideas, are that like how you've filtered those through in your commentary for your Let's Plays and stuff. And, you know, there's a certain number of people who have essentially been, as a result of your ideas proliferating, they sort of, I won't say regurgitate them, but they repeat them in a way where they start to incorporate them into their own thought processes. So what do you make of like how you get to these spaces? Is it something that you've noticed that your ideas tend to be different than a lot of other people's? And how did you get to that point if you had to start to pick a path to this destination that you're at now?
Oh, well, first of all, hello, Pronogo.
Hi.
So, the design, the birthing of designs. I'm thinking as you're talking about how I even describe this, because it is, in a way, it's mundane, because it is a core part of just the way I go through data, the way I sort through data and retain it. But if I really had to pinpoint the threads that lead to that, I would start with just playing a lot of games. Really, playing a lot of repetition in a way. And you find common threads through that repetition. So with StarCraft, that would be with AI. You know, I've had thousands and thousands of hours with unmodded Brood War in just AI. And just, you know, top versus bottom FFAs and stuff like that. And then, of course, with the mods and stuff afterwards. And then I went into observing professional games. I got into the professional scene for Brood War and watched a lot all the way up until really was the match fixing scandal that kind of took me off from there, and the StarCraft 2 launch. And that was when I was kind of aiming more or less towards going into Project Offset and more game design back in like 2009, 2010. I didn't follow professional scene as much by then, but there is just a lot of threads that kind of stuck to me in there. When I look at a project and I play through a project, or I'm thinking about a project, I always go across core characteristics, defining elements. And one of the things I do when I consider a project, a potential project, or I'm updating a project, or just the work in general, is I focus on those core characteristics and I try to make something called a concept. Now, when people make a concept, they might make like a storyboard for something. They might write out like a game document and some ideas. They might, you know, think of like a character or a story or something like that. They might think, okay, so I'm going to have the Master Chief, and he's going to walk through a lot of corridors and shoot a lot of guys with shields and infinite numbers of these flood things that attach to him. Maybe he got like a couple little ideas along the way, like the flood that attach, the different cast members of the Covenant or something like that. And then that's your concept. For me, I tend to focus a lot on interaction concepts, because through all of the just many hours of going through so many different games, there will be little threads that they're independent of the genre, they're independent of whether it's a professional or a versus an AI experience. There will just be these threads that all connect together, the things that keep you coming back. And those core characteristics tend to be related to interactions. So one of the main things I really paid attention to a lot within the professional scene for Brood War was the psychology. One of the things that really kind of stood out to me that really made individual experiences have identification was when you had two players who knew each other quite well, who had played against each other quite well, and maybe they were rivals, maybe they were just, different members of the scene who are on the same sort of bracket professionally. And when they came at odds with one another, you might see them do some really strange things to try to throw each other off guard, or feints into doing so, because maybe some of them have adapted some nature of play and the other one knows that, and they know the other one knows that. You enter psychology and mind games of them trying to throw each other off. And that to me really stands out because it really brought out the beauty of that game in professional play. I am a person who thoroughly believes that games are not art. There really is maybe only like a handful, I would say less than 10 games that really could be considered art. But games can most certainly be used in a way for art, which is the players. The players are using them to create art. And Brood War professional play and some of the, even like Counter-Strike professional play I've seen, albeit I haven't seen very much, and Quake professional play, when the players are at their peak and there's still a ceiling above them, far, far above them, because you can never really quite master these games completely. There's always something to improve. But when they're at a stage where you enter psychology into the equation between two of these players, that really stands out to me. And that to me was my first major experience with that kind of idea. Right. Like I by that point, I had been writing for most of my life anyways. I'd been building customs for 10 years, and I never had really thought about it from psychology. That was a defining moment in how I started to look at projects and reflect on my decisions from then and there onwards. And when we look at all the individual elements, that's a part of why. That's a part of my process of breaking down either a product I'm already engaging or a product I'm building, is what contributes to the psychology of the players. What actually contributes to the mechanisms that drive that psychology. And upgrades, for example, again, they're fire and forget. Now, upgrades are very important in Brood War. They're very important. Especially like that first Protoss melee upgrade, the first Zerg armor upgrades. These upgrades, their timing when you get them and stuff like that, they tend to change how the match is played, because how many hits it takes to kill a Zergling is one of the more important things of PvZ. And when you get those upgrades, if you're able to get them faster, that's obviously really important. But beyond that, beyond these fairly isolated incidents, especially when it comes to, like, say, single-player content or multiplayer content below that skill threshold, the upgrades really just didn't offer that much. They were something you had to get because they influenced numbers. But as you will often find in all my projects and all my reviews and stuff like that, is I don't really give a shit about numbers. Numbers really are just like these invisible things that they're important at the low level of governing how stuff works. But very, very rarely, unless they're forced to, will players really give a shit about numbers. Now, keep in mind, there's a difference between players and consumers. Consumers like to see numbers get bigger. That's a big selling point for modern games. As numbers get bigger, it makes them feel like they're getting somewhere. But in reality, when we look at things from an interaction standpoint, we're looking at things how they're interacting, which it may be governed by numbers, but numbers in themselves don't offer anything interactive. And I mean, unless you're playing, I guess, a very specific kind of like math-driven game. I don't know. It would be something I don't have any experience with anyways. But as far as like the RTS and stuff is really standing out, is what makes the most definition is how things behave. And how things behave comes from how the player interacts with it. And when I looked at my projects, especially from the RTS standpoint from Brood War, is I was looking at expanding from the game and expanding outwards, adding more units, more tech trees, more stuff. And Brood War has a tenuous balance. And when you break away from that balance and start adding stuff to it, adding new units or whatever, I always was under the impression that every single thing you add or take away has to have real world grounding behind the decision making why. It has to be unit tested, it has to be assessed and analyzed. Otherwise, it will not have the same kind of impact and meaning and potential that the original content has. And again, is a little hard for me to word. It's certainly a very complex subject because it is mundane in a sense where it's just a core part of how I think about things. But I always think of things from that standpoint, and professional play is the bar that I go by. Now, that isn't to say that I design things for an esport standpoint, because that's a critical mistake. But I always think of things as a potential high-level play because all interactive mediums exist to drive improvement, self-improvement, and advancement of an individual's abilities, and you want to reach that threshold where these potentials are realized, and things should be designed from those potentials. And so long as those potentials exist and are inviting to you, you will feel inclined to reach for them and explore them, so long as it's a medium you really sync with. So
Okay.
there's so many possible elements of that, but that's like the basic bitch tier level for that kind of stuff.
So it sounds like, when you were explaining the upgrade, the concrete example I offered you was like upgrades in an RTS. One of the things that you brought up about that is that, like, an element of critique to it is that if you're not at the uppermost percentile of players in a professional sense, then you're not able to harvest value from the interaction, right? And even when you do, like, the observation that they are fire and forget still holds true for professional players. It's just that within the elements of a very competitive scene, you can imagine where there's valuable interactions or interesting interactions at play between upgrade breakpoints and timings and stuff. But when you're in a single player context or in a multiplayer context where you're not dealing with professional players, it becomes significantly less valuable, basically the lower down the totem pole you go of ranked play or a certain level of skill. So maybe we can use that concrete example to explore that. Was there a point in development before you had critically analyzed the upgrade side of things, before you had contrasted the play around upgrades at a high level compared to the play around it in a single player context or at a low level of multiplayer? Was there a point before you had made that sort of, I'm going to call it a breakthrough, but came to the conclusion that, upgrades actually don't offer as much, and removing them and taking what they do offer, but incorporating it in a different sense? I'm alluding to, having multiple tiers of tech, way more than what Brood War has, and then being able to have an upgraded, in air quotes, version of a unit or something to that effect. So, like, essentially, could you walk us through how you got to that conclusion, if you even remember, and what sort of steps had to be taken to pull you away from the idea that actually upgrades are okay or they're fine in a RTS context?
It was as a direct result of exploring tech trees. When I was working on building the various Apex concepts for StarCraft 2, and I was looking at introducing the artillery system and the resource injectors, kind of similar to Supreme Commander, and looking at the upwards of up to 10 tiers of units, I was thinking a lot at the time also about how do upgrades fit into this? How am I going to split up the upgrades for these units? So I believe there was a time where initially in Apex's introduction, since we were just using hero units as a basis for the new units, because the data editor in StarCraft 2 has got to be some of the worst software I've ever laid eyes upon. It was really clunky, especially to add anything new. We were just taking shortcuts at the time. We just brought in the hero-related upgrades, too, so that you could unlock those hero upgrades, the special campaign upgrades and stuff like that, with some tweaks in some cases, so a little more balanced. And as I went through the concept building process, which is to make the maps with the AI, of course, AI is very important for this, something that you can play up against, something that would give you some challenge. And then you put all these features to the test. Making those upgrades didn't really feel like a big deal. Like, it was something that you felt like you needed to have to get the most out of the power budget for the unit, because the unit was designed and balanced with that power budget in mind. But that meant that getting those units before having those upgrades, for example, getting siege tanks before having siege tech, just felt like you were getting like half the power budget until you had the leap forward to make the upgrades. But some of these upgrades were so powerful that they had to be either reasonably expensive or deep enough in the tech tree that you could not get them early into the game, where you have a huge power shift just because you decided to focus on this one thing. Especially when you were talking about a more volatile game world where maybe you weren't seeing a lot of early game pressure because it was an FFA map and the one player decided not to attack you for some reason. So you were offered this opportunity to, say, push into siege, the focused shells or whatever it was that granted you higher single target damage. That was a particularly strong upgrade, especially when you had more level-headed numbers for unit health and stuff like that. But the siege tanks is suddenly get a massive damage boost, plus any potential vehicle damage upgrades you manage to snag along the way. Suddenly you would see an effective damage increase of like 30, 40, 50% on siege tanks, which was quite a big deal. But that also meant that if you didn't go for that, then any tanks you did get early on lacked that power. And at least at the time, there was no audio cue differences, graphical cue differences, anything like that I had designed for these things. In a project today, if I had such a thing, I would, of course, have new assets show up for this kind of thing, so there was a read for it. But even so, it was just numbers invisibly altering how the game works. And then once you had it, it was like, okay, now the unit's complete. Now you never think about that ever again. Your tech trees may be destroyed, maybe you have to relocate your base or something like that, but now you always have this power spike you got because you spent some money at some other early stage in the game. One evolution I did from that, because I didn't like that interaction in particular, and I wanted there to be more emphasis on macro play and more emphasis on SimCity and base building and defense and stuff like that. And I had these higher tier artillery, defensive structures and stuff like that you could get. I wanted there to be a reason to have these other than just sitting back and turtling. And one of those was, I want you to have value in your tech structures beyond just being able to build units. So the next evolution was, okay, I don't really like the idea of spending money on upgrades and then them just being a fire and forget. I wanted them to be something interactive. So the next one was to have the tech buildings themselves unlock those upgrades. So long as you owned, let's say, your equivalent of a science facility, you would then have access to Yamato gun and irradiate and stuff like that. And there was lore justifications and writing justifications I can use for that. But at the end of the day, even that didn't really feel very good, because depending on how the map was going or where you were on, especially in a team game, you might just be able to plant your building behind something and then it would still ultimately just be there. And it was just still one of those things where it's like, well, now instead of investing money into an upgrade, you put it into a structure, which was nice because now you had something that the player and the enemy could interact with. But it was still, your investment into the unit was still kind of not really invested into the unit. There was also the extra investment, and the extra investment just felt arbitrary. It was more like, okay, now you've got this unit, but suddenly whatever extra feature it could have, like say something major like defense drones or turrets or something like that, seeker missiles, is suddenly behind another structure. Seeker missiles was really one of the big ones, because seeker missiles at the time were still very much like they were in StarCraft 2 at the time. Fire and forget. If you didn't run away from them, they blew up and they did huge AoE damage. Blizzard would later nerf them into the ground. I eventually absolved to remove all upgrades, and I just made them destructible instead. And they had, so and so much health, and then something that made Marines more valuable because they had a higher attack speed. They could stop and attack these missiles before they reached the target, and they could stop to attack them and react faster than the heavy air at the time. Main guns couldn't attack these missiles; only small weapons could. And that, to me, that was the big shift, really, is when I started introducing destructible projectiles and stuff like that. And I was like, no longer do I need to have this powerful spell, this ability locked behind having this extra tech structure, because now the spell is more balanced in general. It was one of those things where these power spikes from the upgrades were quite high, where siege mode, for example, that's the entire defining feature of the siege tank, and it's extremely powerful. Of course, it's going to be locked behind a tech upgrade. Otherwise, you'll just build a siege tank, and then suddenly you can siege mode. Wow, that's a little overpowered, isn't it? Well, in the context of Brood War, it's a little overpowered because that little bit of extra time and resources kind of stops hitting a critical mass of tanks in certain matchups. But does it really actually contribute to the game, especially in a larger scale? No, not really. Not at all. It's just a hindrance. It's just there. Just, okay, now I'm going to spend money on this upgrade, and in a minute or 2 minutes, I'll have my siege tanks. I toyed around with ideas like increasing costs and time and stuff like that, and I was like, no, I'm just going to make individual tiers more expensive. And then make the defensive structures and any resource injection structures that I had, which were less efficient than mining, of course, and they also exploded and dealt damage to things when they were destroyed. So those were all expensive. Those were like long-term investments. You would get back the investment from building the resource injector after so and so many minutes to justify its cost, and then after that you would start getting a bonus. So that was a big investment. The tech upgrades really weren't like that. It was once you had it, you had it. If you had the structure and you could just stick it somewhere, then, given StarCraft 2's limitations, you weren't really looking at an AI that was intelligent enough to single these structures out to take advantage of removing this one thing from you. So in most cases, I just flat out removed a lot of these number influences like that, and I focused more and more and more on individual behaviors because I like the whole idea of the destructible seeker missile. I'd always wanted to have an SDI, a tactical missile system in it, kind of like Supreme Commander again. And focusing on, sort of like ideas of things I wanted to do back in Retribution, which was Sins of a Solar Empire, and Homeworld 2, and bringing that into StarCraft 2, and it was like, I can have destructible projectiles. That means your power budget can be lied very heavily upon the players interacting with that. Knowing when to deploy it, the enemy knowing when to intercept it, and then, of course, with tactical AI per player, you can make per player tactical AI, you could cheat around it. Each player might behave a little differently in how they react to those missiles. Sometimes they would focus on them right away. Sometimes they'd have a little bit of a lag time to it, depending on their skill level. You could be more brazen with these missiles, or you would have to plan much more carefully with them. And at that point, I was like, okay, so tech upgrades, we don't need those anymore. Because we just basically need to think about the actual units as opposed to taking the easy way out, which is let's make an upgrade that makes this unit more powerful, either so that it's more relevant late game, or because whatever this ability is too powerful to get into offhand, just redesign the whole bloody unit up from scratch. If siege mode is that powerful, then maybe siege tanks should be a little higher up in the tech tree. Why lock siege tech behind this upgrade on top of it? That to me was an interaction, was like a whole bunch of extra steps that, especially when I was looking at having all these new structures, new types of structures, SDI, tactical missile, artillery, and stuff like that. Upgrades got outshone by all the other decision making that you were making as a player constructing your base. They were something that had always been there, but they were something that really didn't command a presence in the game, versus artillery, which had long-range blind fire, versus actual tech upgrades in this, which were much more expensive and time-consuming to do and unlocked new stuff, versus SDI defenses, things that could attack these missiles like the Seeker missile, stuff like that. These decisions and where to spend your resources on them had big game impacts. We were quickly outpacing any kind of impact that upgrades could make in the game in terms of how the players felt when they were playing it versus, oh shit, there's an artillery over there. It's starting to shell my expansion. I'll think about how to deal with that. Or I'm going to make artillery because I can't penetrate these defenses, or there's armies that are constantly coming down this valley and I want to be able to do some damage to them or something like that. Investing in those was a big thing, and using them was a big thing, and you had to interact with their blind fire and stuff like that. The upgrades just didn't stand up to these things in terms of the player psychology. And then we hit the actual, very quickly, I hit the actual point where I was like, okay, so I'm removing tech upgrades like Siege Mode and Seeker Missile, and they're just going to have these things, and I'm just going to redesign them to be either more balanced and less influential as to require something like this, or whatever. Focus more on how things behave and less on just the raw numbers. And then we hit the actual upgrades, where I had these problems where basically my battlecruiser, I changed in the same tech places we had the battlecruiser. We now had a Corvette. The Corvette was just, think of it as a battlecruiser, but its damage was more front loaded. And then it had a secondary weapon, which was kind of like a defensive weapon that shot at up to so many targets around it with missiles. And positioning the battlecruiser was really important so you could get most of those missiles to hit one target. This is a very positionally dependent unit, and knowing where to focus its main guns because they fired in a long volley was also important. having those main guns shoot something like a Devourer or a Leviathan versus a Zergling or a Hydra was much more valuable use of that front-loaded barrage. But I reached points where I had all these units with all these multiple hit weapons, and I was kind of struggling a little bit with the upgrades. It was like, well, with your vehicle upgrades, if you took this to say +3, suddenly these multi-hit weapons are gaining an enormous amount of effective damage out of it, especially if something's armor remains static, like structures, for example. In typical StarCraft, or at least I believe, they do not receive armor upgrades. Or some shields may not receive upgrades if they don't have a Protoss shield upgrade. Or maybe it's just the way that the map is laid out where they only get so many upgrades. These per hit attacks only deal huge amounts of damage. The inverse is true too. I made buildings get armor upgrades to try to offset some of this. But if they got armor upgrades and then there wasn't any weapon upgrades, the power shift was absolutely massive. Absolutely massive. So I ended up reducing the barrage damage on these battlecruisers to like a quarter of what it originally was, and it was still ridiculously strong, and it was still a little tough to balance. And I started to ask questions. Like, when I reach this point where I'm not entirely sure how to proceed, what I do is I step back and I try to readdress the whole equation. In StarCraft 1, I had all these total conversions, like, say, for example, Armageddon Onslaught. And they had all these upgrades. But Armageddon Onslaught had no upgrades at all. Only the players got upgrades. And the upgrades were the primary balancing factor of how the players dealt with late game Armageddon. You had to get those armor upgrades to stop these multi-hit attacks from just destroying you. Because each 1 point of armor reduced an attack by, say, 6, 7, 8 damage in total. Because each tick was being calculated for armor. And that made sense in that context. But it also... it was like a Band-Aid solution, because I didn't want to change the races other than Armageddon, even though I did. I nerfed nuke damage, for example, because it did like percentage damage or something. It was really too strong. And I changed some stuff from concussive to like normal or explosive damage, like ghosts and vultures. So they were more relevant as most of the units became very large. But I didn't want to change upgrades. So I treated them as a balancing perspective. But in starting with something from scratch, I saw upgrades as something that was giving me difficulties. And at the end of the day, the interaction that was coming out of it, it was still kind of invisible to the player. So the net reflex was to just very quickly say, I'm going to cut this because this isn't actually really contributing much. I just looked at upgrades where I was trying to make them work. I even had high tiers of upgrades. And I just said, I'm just going to cut the whole bloody thing and see how it goes without it. Making huge sweeping changes in a project is not really uncommon for me. But I hadn't really thought too much about upgrades until I was in Armageddon Onslaught and dealing with the armor stuff and balancing multi-hits based off of that. And then again, when we reached that point within StarCraft 2, it was really the multi-hit attacks that really brought me into that arena again and made me ask the questions, what actually are upgrades adding to the game? I have to balance the game around the base damage of the units and then each upgrade tier. And I'm looking at doing that for something that I'm entering an arena that nobody's ever done before. It's completely unexplored. Nobody's ever even attempted to make a project like this before. At all. Period. The closest to come after the fact would be your projects. And you would have the same issues. And you'd face the same challenges. And at the time, it was like, I'm going to cut this and I'm going to go without it. And we're going to see how it goes. And I just never came back to it. It just felt the most natural thing to do. It was like, well, now I don't have to worry about this extra layer of not really content, but of numbers influencing everything on top of it. I can balance everything against each other as they are. And I never have to worry about that changing. It's more consistent. And consistency is key.
So there's like a deeper truth almost to or like a a process that you've sort of hinted at there when you were referencing Armageddon Onslaught, which is this high scale conversion that completely replaces Zerg, but it leaves Terrans and Protoss, like you said, mostly untouched. There's some slight rebalancing of things. And you mentioned that because like you didn't really want to make sweeping changes to the two races that you weren't going to be replacing. And so you left that mostly as it was. And something even before you brought that example up that I was thinking about when you were talking about redesigning a bunch of things or designing entirely new things in the case of your tech trees in the Apex project for StarCraft 2. You mentioned that like by virtue of exploring this sort of untrodden, like this path never traveled or less traveled at the very least, it made you have to re-examine all of these elements, and that's what forced you to eventually step back and then like assess things and say, okay, well, the problem is repeatedly like this upgrade interaction with armor and multi-attacks and stuff. So like that's like one obvious example of it falling short and negatively impacting the rest of the game. And the sort of the lesson I think that a lot of people can take from that, and something that has definitely held true for myself, is that when the time comes to make your own thing, like modders especially will fall victim to this, where they don't ever really go and make their own thing. They're mostly working within, like they've bought into a number of premises that are laid out by whatever they're modding, and as a result, they don't have the thought process or the general design process that requires that forces them to like re-examine everything and decide what actually is justified. And also it's quite hard, I think, to do that if you're modding something but you're not replacing everything within the project that you're modding. Whereas like if you're making a total conversion in Brood War, or you're making a total conversion in like Sins of the Solar Empire, like you mentioned with Retribution, like you're able to just completely remove the old content from your mind, and you're building everything up from scratch. So you're building all the tech trees yourself, or all of the individual entities and the units and how the ships work and stuff. And so when you're in the process of designing that, it's like you're exploring this thought frontier that I referenced at the beginning of this. And it's like you're, by virtue of having to do that, you don't have the luxury of the old content, but you also don't have the negative aspect of it like dragging you down. Yeah, it's not there anymore, so you've got to do more work because you have to build more things so that your game is feature complete. But by virtue of doing that, it's actually better for the overall process. And I don't think that there's a large influx of game designers in the modern era that come from modders, like a modding background. I'm sure that is true for some of them.
There's very few modders.
Yeah, well, that's true as well. There's not that many of us left, so to speak. But it doesn't feel like so many modders ever fully make the transition over into a game developer and they build their own thing. It feels more like, I guess it's just a truism of generating media, is that you're going to get a lot of derivatives, a lot of cargo culting, and a lot of people who they don't have their own ideas and they don't have their own content to bring to bear. They're just going to ape from whatever came before. It's especially easy to get sucked into this if you're making a sequel or a spin-off from something that's already there. What do you think was like made you always strive to build something new and to get into this thought process and design process where you're exploring the thought frontier? Like if you're going to say that like, okay, I built my own tech trees and that's what resulted in the shift for upgrades and like allowed me to step away from it because I wasn't modifying the original content anymore. I was making my own content. And like, I think it's easy for us to say then that makes it easier to critically assess it. If it's entirely yours, then you're much more familiar with it on an intimate subject. But like, how do you get to the point where every project you work on, maybe this isn't even true. Is it true that every project that you worked on for the most part was like a total conversion in that sense, or that brought more original content than it left the original content intact? And how do you get to the point where that's like most of what you work on? Is that just mostly what you're interested in when it comes to working on projects?
I'm trying to think if there's a case where it wasn't the case. And I think the closest I get is some of the very early projects we had where we just adjusted some of the stuff in Halo PC. Log mods, if you're familiar with those, that was before Custom Edition came out. You had these third-party editors that could like, I forget precisely how it worked because it was so long ago, but they could inject stuff into levels and stuff like that. So we had custom textures and sounds and some stuff like that. And then there was a UT99 project that just changed how weapons behave and stuff. That's really the closest I get to making derivative works. I have always been somebody who just builds stuff. I honestly have a really hard time understanding the drive of anybody who tries to make fan projects, of anyone who tries to make small scale works of that nature. And this goes all the way back to when I was writing. So I was writing as early and making tape deck stuff when I was a toddler, and I grew up just imagining worlds, and putting characters in them, and conflicts between them. Of course, very juvenile, simple stuff back then. Heavily influenced by media that I was associated with, but always something that stood alone. I took elements from them and changed those elements and made them my own, and that was just something that was always second nature to me. And I have an extremely hard time comprehending why anybody would not do that. And especially when we enter the realm of digital content creation with something like StarCraft, I have always felt that if you are going to build something, why wouldn't you build your own something? Why wouldn't you make your own everything? Now, let's say, for example, for some reason you want to make a campaign, but you don't want to get into making voices or graphics, even though they're extremely easy to get into. Let's say you don't want to. Let's say you've got time constraints or something. Well, with the existing assets, you still can create your own setting. You can still create your own story, your own characters. Why would you restrict yourself intentionally? Why would you hobble and cripple yourself with Metzen's drivel, with this incomprehensible, inconsistent mess that Blizzard has left behind? Or let's say, in a different spectrum, something like Open Rebellion or Gundam Century. You had two people who walked into StarCraft who had experience either porting assets and rendering them or otherwise making assets and bringing them into StarCraft, and they looked relatively recent. One was Gundam, one was Star Wars. I never understood why somebody who had these kinds of skills would restrict themselves just to making these projects, which at the end of the day, they did basically nothing with the actual game besides bring in graphics that look decent, which, hey, that's cool, but you don't have a project. You just have StarCraft with a different veneer. And the same can be said for just about every total conversion I've ever played. Fungus Craft, the Star Trek Dominion War, whatever it was. Most of the campaigns are out there. They've added voice acting, graphics to whatever extent. It's still just StarCraft at the end of the day. Oh, look, it's Star Wars. They've got clips from the movies. They've got clips from other games in Star Wars. It still plays like StarCraft. It still has the same tiers, the same unit behaviors, all this other stuff. But they've also just taken something else and put that something else into something else. They didn't make it. They didn't make their own thing. To me, it is an injustice to your own time, your own potential to restrict yourself to something else. Plus, no matter how hard you work on making these fan projects, you will never become the actual project. You will never be George Lucas. You'll never be the individual who made the first Gundam anime. You'll never be these studios. You'll never make your own anime. You rob yourself of the potential. Now, I've had this kind of conversation with many people before, and their response is basically to say, well, I can't really think of anything I want to make on my own. I don't have any ambition on my own. And I find that hard to believe in many respects, because what is it that drove you to make these projects, which still consume a lot of time? It still takes a lot of time to either make these assets or bring them out of whatever and render them and sort them out, put them in StarCraft, Gundam Century and stuff like that. Those always stood out to me early on because they were the only projects who were really making these transparent overlays. And that's a little different than just rendering a model out. Having the engine graphics and the effects and everything like that, that really stood out to me at the time as the early beginnings of StarCraft. They get information on how to do this and how to do this in a way that looked any good. Just simply didn't exist, as far as I know, still doesn't exist today. And they just came in and did it, silently, and they did their own thing. I always had a degree of respect for these people, but I always asked, why didn't you just make your own project? Why did you make a fan project? For me, the inverse is the case. I can't even begin to comprehend why people don't make their own thing. There are some like joke projects I've conceptualized or built out prototypes for or otherwise written down that were built in the StarCraft universe. You had the Overmind that was an elf loli. You had Zeratul and Raynor's love triangle with Kerrigan, who was a Fuda. You had all these politically incorrect projects that sort of use StarCraft as a basis. But at the end of the day, these projects were still built on a framework that completely changed the entire game. They were just an excuse to change the entire game without having sort of the innate need to redesign all the races visually and aesthetically. It was something I could just kit bash together. It was like small scale. That's my idea of a small scale, is I rebuilt the entire game anyways. I'm just not doing it in a manner which completely changes all the aesthetic, 0 to 100. And I'm still really just, at the end of the day, I'm just using some ideas and some names. And that, to me, even at the end of the day, I never followed through on those because they were not enough. And I can't really separate that process from otherwise because I can't understand otherwise. There was something that someone, I don't know if it was on your server or someone else, that someone posted a while ago, where people apparently have a hard time visualizing stuff in their heads. They couldn't visualize like an apple in their minds. And I can't imagine a world where that is not possible. I can close my eyes and I can visualize anything I want. A lot of the game projects and some elements of the game projects and my writing comes from my dreams, either actual dreams or daydreams, where I'm inside a living, breathing world. The one I still vividly remember to this day from a good 15, 16 years ago is being in the bridge of a ship, an Anan ship going through Jump and fighting Dieth Jin, and all the crews surrounding me and the main displays and all the sounds and yelling and traffic and just being in that environment, almost like a movie, but in first person. I've had so many of those of StarCraft projects and stuff like that as well. And willfully, I can just close my eyes, snap my fingers, and I can build just about anything I want with that. I've had some struggles with that in the last couple of years because of depression, especially after my cats died. That spark kind of died with them for a while, and that was fucking terrifying. That was such a foreign and alien world where I couldn't just strike the Flintstone and suddenly I had stuff. And I can't imagine living like that. So I unfortunately cannot connect with people who are supposedly like that. I honestly have a hard time believing they even exist because I can't imagine a world where people like that do exist. But even though I've encountered people like that, I don't even know what to tell them. Like, you have HCast, who's worked with me for like 2 decades now on all these projects to present day. And he tried to get into his own projects and stuff like that, and he kind of really struggled in that manner. And even though that was someone who I've known for so many years, I can't connect in the manner in which I understand what the difference between us really is. I'm a really shitty person at socializing in general, so this kind of stuff really is hard for me to get into in general, but I really just don't understand the opposite side of the fence at all.
So that sort of brings us, you even referenced to present day. You've got a Unreal 4 project going,
yep.
And you've been, I guess it might be Unreal 5 now. You might be able to talk a little bit about the technical process of going between the two. But briefly, to sort of summarize the project, it's an action RPG. It's over-the-shoulder third-person camera. And there's some ways in which it deviates very heavily from work that you've done this far, but also from the rest of the action RPG catalog, if you were going to describe that third-person ARPG genre. Titles like, God of War obviously come to mind, but also Devil May Cry, a little bit of an older shout. Can you speak a little bit to what inspired you to pick up the mantle of the ARPG and to specifically to go from an RTS to that? Because they are, in my mind, two very different genres. Maybe you can talk a little bit as to why you made that jump and you sort of like transitioned away from RTS into ARPG, but also what, in your own words, I guess, separates your work in the ARPG genre from all of the titles that have come before.
There's definitely a few threads that drove me into the ARPG. Probably the most powerful of the threads is my experiences with MOBAs or Dota clones. So League of Legends and Heroes of the Storm very specifically. League of Legends, I played to a reasonable extent with different groups of players. And then the same as with Heroes of the Storm is more recent. And throughout both of those, I ascended to quite competent levels of skill. And I didn't have a super deep understanding of League of Legends, but I did watch it professionally, not nearly as much as Brood War, but enough to follow the game for a while. And I played ADC and I played mids and I played these sort of volatile positions with a lot of responsibility and a lot of difficulty associated with them, especially since when I played mid lane with a lot of these groups, I would get put up against people that were diamond, that were in masters, people who had thousands more games under their belt than I did. And I would usually go even with them. And I would struggle a lot in mid or early game rather. My laning mechanics weren't as good as later on. And I had this sort of regime where I trained my skill shots and stuff like that. I played heroes that were typically much more difficult to play than what would be considered meta at the time. So you had a lot of like Ari, Min Nidalee, Zyra. There was AP Kog'Maw was another one. And all these, especially like AP Kog'Maw and stuff like that, really were risky picks. But sometimes I would go up against they weren't ranked. A lot of these were not ranked. But I would still go up against, duos, trios, otherwise pre-mains of really difficult opponents. And then this would translate into Heroes of the Storm, where I would again play these characters that were not very safe. They were really dependent on mechanical skill and map awareness and stuff like that. And what drove me to continue to play these games, other than their, the nature of playing with the individuals I was playing with, was the mechanical skill expression I was eventually able to perform. So, especially like playing the mid laners or playing like Li Ming and Heroes of the Storm, to be able to mechanically overpower other players to win these lopsided matches, because a lot of the people that I played with were absolutely nowhere near me in really any manner. And there really wasn't much communication going on between these groups at all. And a lot of these people are very prone to becoming very salty and throwing matches. And I kind of treated myself as an island and my own self-improvement as an island. And it got to the point in these games where my statistics and my performance were telling me, hey, you're doing really well. You're doing really well. If you really wanted to take this game seriously, if you really wanted to go in the ranked grind, you could get to the top. And I never really was able to. I never really had that particular drive. But those experiences still stuck with me for a long time. And I still look back at them today fairly fondly. And there's definitely a lot of mistakes I can point out my play, especially today. But it's still an experience that stuck with me. Now, prior to really getting into these titles, I did, of course, a lot of LPs, and the ARPG, the third-person action game, is really the main genre that I kind of had. And at the time, it was mostly just because those were the titles that I hadn't been able to play or didn't really want to play without recording or otherwise just kind of gravitated around. It was more happenstance than anything. But my first major title other than Wings of Liberty itself was Darksiders. And then we started going into stuff like people were like, oh, you should play Demon Souls. We got into Demon Souls. And then there was Devil May Cry, which, many people told me about. You should get into Devil May Cry. That's the ancestor of God of War. It's quite different. And we got into Devil May Cry. And Devil May Cry was a really eye-opening experience in just so many ways. Because Devil May Cry 1, of course, that was originally going to be a Resident Evil title, and they got sort of shifted around into this kind of a mishmash between Resident Evil and action RPG. And I think I just ran that game at a really specific point in my growth of a developer. Because that was, I forget the exact years, it was around 2012, 2013, 2014, around that kind of time. There was a lot of shuffling and a lot of drama in my life at that point, and also within my development life, where 2009 I set down Armageddon Onslaught and I was like, I'm ready to move on. Project Offset, which was a engine, you can think of it almost like Unity or Unreal at the time, was on the horizon, and that's where my first exposure to node-based editors and stuff like that, that's where it was being advertised from. And it was advertised as an engine that somebody could get into, and it had wide support and was very powerful. I ended up building a system at that time to get into 3D rendering for Armageddon Onslaught and for Project Offset. Well, Project Offset got bought by Intel, I believe, and it never saw the light of day. I think that Firefall may still have used it, and that's all I personally remember of that. It just kind of disappeared after the fact, as things that get bought by these shitty companies often do. And And that killed everything, all my ambition at that point. So then StarCraft 2 was announced, and I was like, okay, well, we'll get into StarCraft 2. I'll just continue where I left off with StarCraft 1. But I had to admit that at that point, although I had all these different, like eventually what became Apex, all these different ideas for the RTS, I had sort of become disinterested in the RTS in many ways. I'm not really sure why. I think it's just kind of, I had been with the RTS for all my life up to that point as far as digital content creation was concerned. I'd gone through all these different RTSs. And Brood War, I saw, I guess, what a lot would consider unparalleled success in. Well, I didn't really see it as really that much success, though, because there's still a lot of stuff that I either couldn't finish or couldn't really do, or for whatever reason. StarCraft 2 was one of those things where I looked at very skeptically because Warcraft 3 was such a blithering failure. And I, at that point, had been well acquainted with the way that Blizzard does business and the way Blizzard makes games. And I knew not really to expect that much with StarCraft 2, but I was still tentatively hopeful. Then, of course, StarCraft 2 came out, and it was beyond imagination worse than I could have ever feared. And that killed all. I tried all kinds of different stuff, and of course, I tried ARPGs in StarCraft 2, and when it came out, I did the whole meme of the third-person shooter in that, and that obviously doesn't perform properly at all. The AI was a horrendous mess that it would take us years to really crack open, and even then, it was just to discover more rats' nests. And I flip-flopped a lot with that, evidently, and went back and forth. And we saw going into Sins of a Solar Empire, picking up where I left off with the space-based kind of designs with 2008, where I was messing around in Homeworld 2 and a little bit of Sins of a Solar Empire. I saw Salvation and Retribution. I gave up on projects and those for total conversions for the same reason I did StarCraft 2. It was too much of a mess to get into. It was just incomprehensibly stupid how those games were made. And instead, I made these machinima kind of projects instead. 2014 happened, I got dumped, all this other stuff. But I think it was really like Devil May Cry and God of War, because God of War was a game that was just like a QTE carnival with some of this incredibly frustrating designs all across the board. And all throughout all these games, this was started really getting me embittered to the whole thing. Is it wasn't just the RTS genre that was suffering; it was every genre. And then I would go through the games, and I'd sit at the end of the day, and I'd look at it and be like, "This could have been done so much better." And then we got into Devil May Cry. And Devil May Cry 1 was an eye-opening. It was like, wow, this was a project that was really clumsy and slapped together from different ideas. And there was still so much cool stuff in it. And I read about how it was received, and Americans thought it was too hard. And they cried. And I didn't find it that difficult at all. I mean, I struggled a little bit in it, but in any game you're going to struggle. It's all part of learning. And then we got into DMC 2, which a lot of people didn't like, but I mean, it was painfully easy. I went through most of the game with a rocket launcher, just shooting stuff at max range. And I was like, okay, well, it was an explorative title, and they kind of struggled with it. And then DMC 3, they kind of dialed back. But then DMC 3 had a lot of dumb shit in it too. But DMC 3 overall is still a fairly positive title. And I guess it was just that perfect storm of moving out of RTS and kind of just StarCraft 2 just really embittered me into the whole idea of the whole thing. Because it was just, everything about it was just so appalling. And then I walked into the ARPG, which God of War always kind of held my interest until I really got into it and experienced the sheer depth of the stupidity in those games. And then DMC was like a fresh breath of air. And then we kind of got to see this Itsuno guy take DMC and shit all over it. And then there was Dragon's Dogma as well, which very much the same story, very promising, very rushed, very incomplete, very hodgepodge. Itsuno got his hands on that, and everything he touched to turn to shit in that too. And all those games, they just left me like, these are frameworks that were built in just a few months of time. I really liked the good parts. In the bad parts, you really could just delete them and you had a good product still at the end of the day. There was always that interaction of like, I could certainly do better if I had these kind of resources and skill sets. And those two just mixed together, and it just took me to ARPGs. And but I saw the potentials of the ARPG a little different. People kind of see them as like a hack and slash third person action. I see it as I can take those experiences from League of Legends, Heroes of Storm, and other kinds of things, those competitive skill and technical testing experiences of individuals trying to overpower one another with, again, psychology. Referencing all these threads all connect together. And having skill-based mechanics. So something kind of unlike the ARPG as it was. ARPG, it isn't even really a good idea of describing these games because they're not even really RPGs in any sense of the fashion. But I wanted to distill and remove all the things that didn't belong. Things like upgrades and level ups and experience and QTEs and all this other rubbish. I wanted to replace it with the idea of skill testing gameplay. And DMC had a chunk of these. It showed us what the potential laid in, even with its most basic archaic functionality. We had the dual fights in those that were exciting. We had some of the trash fights were exciting early on into DMC 3. And DMC 1 and stuff like that, with the exploration mixed in. It's hard for me to put into words, but that's really just what really snagged me and stuck with me, especially when I was experiencing so many bad titles. Then, of course, I got into the Souls games, which are basically untested prototypes using this really awful Sony engine from way back. Because apparently Sony came to them and was like, we want you to one-up Bethesda. And they basically made one of the few series that manages to be more buggy than most of Bethesda's titles, as difficult it is to imagine. But Dark Souls, a lot of that Dark Souls still stuck with me because I really like the aesthetic and the exploration aspects of it. Dark Souls really didn't have much gameplay to speak of. Its combat system is probably the most basic of any of these kinds of games. But there was still, some qualities that kind of stuck with me, and all that just kind of meshed together. But really, the driving part was really those interactive mechanisms again. Because the thing about League of Legends and everything like it is they use this top-down RTS framework because that's what Dota did. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. With Blizzard Dota, with Heroes of the Storm, your skill shots are offset from your cursor. And as far as I know, they've never fixed this. And that's just as a result of it being 3D for one. None of these games should have been 3D to begin with. They gain absolutely nothing from being 3D. It just makes them more confusing, if anything. And League of Legends had such a crazy high skill ceiling just to read what the fuck was going on in any given team fight. Which only got worse the more shit they added, especially with all these invisible numbers, every 3 hits interactions, and all these item behaviors that were only up at specific times. It was just a real confusing mess, and a lot of the game effectively came down to either chance or slightly out of position and somebody got a point-and-click stun on you and the whole team fight got exploded on that one initiative or some other thing. And with all this disaster, I just kind of push all that aside and focused really exclusively on the things, those mid laner skill shot fights and moving around each other and trying to figure out where you're going to go and trying to outsmart one another. I focused on those elements. I distilled it all down to the things that really actually mattered, that really actually stuck with you, those characteristics. And that was just passed over into the idea of what DMC and Dragon's Dogma to an extent nourished, is that this is what combat should be like, not punch a fucking boulder and mashing square for half an hour, or perform a series of Simon Says to kill the boss and watch this cinematic. Just get rid of all this cruft. Right? And then we got new Unreal 4. And with Unreal 4, originally, I wanted to use that to make cinematics for my machinima. I wanted to use this. I started with UDK rather than Unreal 4 for this, experimenting with so many reasons I really didn't get into it. When we passed into Unreal 4 came out, and I was actually an early subscriber for that and did early experiments with that and got into it. It's really exciting. It's also really daunting. And I have learning disabilities, and I really didn't get into it. But I always had, because of all these separate things, these separate unrelated experiences that just lingered. They were the things I clung to all these years, especially as I got really, really bitter about StarCraft 2. Eventually, I would do the technical work for StarCrafts, and I would train HKS, and we would basically do their entire project's art, other than the actual sprites that came from Carbot himself. my technical stuff went into Dwarven combat. He would win $10,000 for that. He'd buy himself some nice beer and some nice hookers. And then, a little bit of my work, the first animations I ever did for any project from scratch, that went into Antioch Chronicles 3 of all places. Little bits and pieces of all those years, they went to other people's stuff. Nothing I did really amounted to anything. It just never really quite clicked. And I didn't want to bring that into Unreal because I didn't have any interest in RTS. I didn't pursue Retribution anymore. I was years old at that point, long abandoned. So I thought, why not make something like what I saw the potential in with DMC? So my project, I began this back in, I believe, the end of 2019. This project is kind of deeply intertwined with my cats, unfortunately. And the reason why I started the project on the spot and decided is because one of my two cats at the time nearly died from what I think was a stroke. And this led to a diagnosis. It was from blood pressure, and it led to a diagnosis of kidney failure. And that was kind of like turning what little remained of my world at the time, because life had always been volatile, upside down and turning it into a huge goddamn mess. And for some reason at the time, that was the kick in the balls that told me you should really take what time you have left before shit gets really bad to do the stuff you actually want to do before things get too bad to do anything at all. And a lot of people struggle with like procrastination and, maybe like a lack of confidence or whatever. I'm the worst for this. I'm terrible for this. I've worked so much, but I work so slowly. I put a lot of time into stuff, but I struggle so much. I worked with graphics for 20 years. I still don't really understand much of anything at all about graphics. But I wanted to get into Unreal for all this time, especially after it went free. And I had resources to do so. I knew all these people who were programmers. Most of them didn't know Unreal, but they could introduce me to the concepts I could apply to Unreal. You had, again, HKS, who was getting into programming and knew this stuff and could answer a lot of my questions. I had access to the resources, but I never really wanted to take the plunge. But for some reason, that was the time I took the plunge. And I started to work on this project, and then it struggled for many reasons. Often art assets for the character are what held me back, and it died, and it lived, and it died. And that cat died, and then the other cat died suddenly, not even a year after the first cat died. And that was during the time I was thinking and starting to pick up the project again. And I was going to drop the whole goddamn thing. And I was going to... Many times I wanted to drop off from custom content, but I didn't. For whatever reason, it just... The itch gets to you. And at the end of that year, I decided I was going to take the plunge. I was going to figure out how to do weight painting on this World of Warcraft model of all things and put that in the game. This is the closest thing to what I wanted to player character really look like. It was the closest thing I really felt comfortable with, especially since I'd worked with that asset before trying to do this stuff. And it's a goddamn mess, but over the course of a month, I weight painted it. I got it onto the mannequin. I could use the animations I had. I got it in, and I said, we're going to put some time into this. And that was last December. And that project is definitely very volatile. But I walk into it with those ideas that I've built up all over the years. I have that vision in my head of what I want things to look like and what I want things to feel like. And again, I focus on those interaction mechanics to say, I want this to be what the player feels like. I want to replicate what I felt in those very challenging, very difficult, very demanding matches within League of Legends, within Heroes of the Storm, distilled of all the crap that surrounds it, distilled of all the shit that just doesn't belong in any of these kinds of titles, just the items, the talent trees, the level ups. None of this stuff belongs. That stuff doesn't stick with you. What sticks with you is how you interacted with your opponent. We pull upon all these experiences. When I look at a project, when I look at ideas, when I look at like StarCraft 2, Homeworld 2, Unreal 4, any platform, I've gone through so many games. I've modded dozens of games. To me, they're all the same thing. The tools may be different. The experiences may be different. Some things are harder. Some things are easier, whatever. At the end of the day, you're still looking for the same thing. You still want the same thing out of your project with those. All I'm doing, in my eyes, is walking back the footsteps I've already tread within Brood War and StarCraft 2. The genre is different. The ideas are a little different. What I'm trying to accomplish is still the same thing. I still want skill testing gameplay. I still want something you can jump into that asks you to improve to be a good player. I look at all these other projects like Dark Souls and DMC and God of War, all these games that have little tiny inklings of potential in them, but as a whole are a mess. And I take the things that are good and I build them into my ideas. And I like to summarize it as Dark Souls, but difficult, DMC, but challenging, and set in, of course, my own worlds, right? My own writing. So I don't know if you have anything specific you wanted to go off of that, but that's...
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think you sort of crossed the threshold when you mentioned that in many respects, the platforms, be they for modding or for your own game, in the case of Unreal, all boil down to offering the same thing. And that's why you picked them up in the first place, is so that you can really go back. And you mentioned specifically going back to walking back the steps of Brood War and of StarCraft 2. And I feel like this is as good a time as any to broach the subject of AI, of enemies in these games.
Absolutely.
So talk to me about how the AI in your action game, you mentioned ARPG might not even be a proper term for it, considering the lack of the RPG aspect of it. But if we're going to go with that label for now, how does your game approach AI? How do you approach AI in a way that is very different to the competition, the other games in a similar genre?
I'm going to grab some coffee, and I will answer that question in just a second.
Let's do it.
So AI is obviously one of the most important things of any game. AI is critical. You can't have a game with any kind of opponent without having good AI. Otherwise, it's not really much of an opponent. Now, when it comes to like League of Legends, Blizzard, Dota, stuff like that, you have AI in those, which are very silly at the best of times. In titles like God of War, Dark Souls, DMC, to much of an extent, you don't actually have an AI. You basically have a script that just auto-fires stuff on a cooldown. And it's not very interesting. So what ends up happening is these developers are like, oh, our opponents are not very exciting. You've got Demon Souls all the way up to Elden Ring, which, as far as I've seen, although I'll know more when I actually get to running that, probably this summer. But as, let's say, Dark Souls 3, pretty much the same thing. The AI never changed in any of those games. The AI is pretty much exactly the same. And what they did is they made the enemies track you more. They made the collision more silly. They gave them a lot of root motion that follows you around, a lot of chained root motion attacks and stuff like that, rather than making the AI interesting. The most interesting fight in Dark Souls 3 to me was that last Phantom with the church Phantom, I think it was, with the staff and the bow. And it was still just pretty much the same Phantom as AI as all the others, but the mix up in the weapons and stuff like that was more interesting to me. And it kind of like showed, this is what the game could have been like instead of, Wolnir. And a lot of, very simple. Again, Souls combat is brain dead simple, as dumb as it gets. And you still could do some interesting little fights with it, little interesting duels with it. That was a fight that didn't have all this chaining root motion and stuff like that. Apparently Elden Ring, I don't know, I've heard a few people say that there's some balancing issues where they've treated it like you have the Bloodborne parrying kind of movesets, I guess, and but you're playing basically a Souls game against Bloodborne enemies, and the infinite chaining attacks tend to be an issue or something like that. I don't know, but there's still like a distinct lack of real pursuit of AI in any of these games. But I've come from a background where AI is obviously the driving factor, is one of the 4 pillars of game design. You can't have a game without AI. So how are we going to approach AI in an ARPG? We're going to try and make an opponent. Now, the most important thing that I want to put down when I talk about AI is I'm not trying to create a human opponent. The biggest issue with a lot of these modern and semi-modern games is they try to replicate human behavior. One of the biggest issues with StarCraft 2 is AI from the very foundation, from the get-go, is the mindset behind it. They try to simulate mouse clicks and APM, and you just can't do that. It's an incredibly stupid thing to do with AI. To even consider doing something like that just insinuates you have no idea what the fuck you're doing. It is such a waste of time, and all it does is just, it hamstrings your AI. It hamstrings its performance, and ultimately ends up consuming performance of the actual already incredibly poorly performing engine even more. And we have to accept that at the ground level, we're not going to be able to replicate a player. It's not going to happen. Because a player is capable of things you're just never going to do. You can have the AI try to learn things that the player does, try to adapt things that the player does, but at the end of the day, you will have to accept for something that resembles a player and can use player-alike timing, as I intend to study professional fighting games and stuff like that quite intently, look up hard numbers for, professional fighting and reflexes and stuff like that, and I'll be working those numbers into my AI for input reads and stuff like that for how they reflect, how an actual skilled player might respond to certain events. But at the end of the day, you're still working with a computer that is controlling something that is not the player character, and it's going to be a lot different than the player no matter what. So what I do, what I've always focused on first and foremost, is aggression. Now, one of the things you're going to note about pretty much all these games, God of War, Souls, etc., is enemies are just not really aggressive. There are scripted aggression events, but there sure is also a heck of a lot of standing around. Now, in many cases, that's kind of because they need to stand around to give the player the option to do something. They're effectively turn-based games. Like Dark Souls, in most cases, is a turn-based game. The enemy does a thing, you roll or block or back away or whatever, and then you get to do a thing afterwards. And then it turns into a turn-based, with the exception of parrying, when you can actually parry. In many cases, you can kind of just, especially in the earlier games before they made them basically effectively always face you. They're like a hard facing. And Demon Souls and much of Dark Souls 1, you can just walk up and just run behind the enemy and backstab them, and that is that. It's actually really funny. And the way they change the other games, it's like they always got to face you. You maybe encountered that in your little bit with Dark Souls with those spear undead, where they will just stand there for fucking ever doing nothing. But they're always facing you, always with their shields up. So it can be, it is such a stupid interaction. Now, one of the games I played a while ago was I believe it was UDK. It was supposed to be a puzzle game called The Ball. And it really wasn't a puzzle game. It was bad. But one of the very interesting things from that game was the few enemies that spawn in it, these sort of zombies. And I imagine these zombies are just using Baby's First AI copy-pasted off of the forum or whatever. And Baby's First AI has no limiters. Baby's First AI chases you and beats the shit out of you. If you get in range of them, they beat the shit out of you. You can't attack them or do anything. You gotta use a ball to squish them. But the fact is that they chase you. They're aggressive. Not only was that incredibly jarring for the rest of the game, which is basically me falling asleep, it was like, wow, this is the whole thing was just again Baby's first game. But the AI, because it had none of this extra fluff surrounding this, none of this unnecessary shit surrounding it, it literally just was pursue and attack. And suddenly you got pulled into the game. Suddenly you had to pay attention to where these dudes were, how many there were, where the ball was, how you're going to deal with them, how you're going to avoid them. Suddenly this became a whole totally different game. It changed. It threw everything on top of its head instantly. And that was a very positive experience. It was a very positive experience to suddenly have something I actually have to care about, I actually have to respect, because yes, they are dangerous, and yes, they will just keep pursuing you. I couldn't afford to ignore them. Where in a lot of these games, I can just afford to ignore them, or some other interaction happens where it's sort of outside my control, or it's just maybe tedious, predictable, but tedious, and maybe just inherently risky. And like there's enemies in Dark Souls that like auto parry you, and you just attack them, they just instantly parry you, and it's an input read, and it's really annoying when it shows up, and it just kind of comes out of nowhere. As opposed to all the enemies, at least, trying to parry you, the ones that could, with like small shields or whatever. It's just these very specific enemies with like parrying daggers or small shields or something like that. Just suddenly, these guys can parry you. Oh, fuck, you're dead. Little gotcha. They like gotchas in those games. This is one of them. And then the enemies themselves are otherwise identical to everything else. So there's a lot of these games, they've got gimmicks attached to the enemies as opposed to them really being aggressive. Aggressive enemies really don't exist in games. It's extremely rare. The most you're really going to encounter it is going to be like the bots and like Counter-Strike. They can be really aggressive too, especially when you ramp them up. Now the bots in Counter-Strike Go are nerfed from the ones in Source. It's really weird that they did that too, but even if you change their values, the numbers and their attributes, you just cannot make them nearly as just pinpoint flip-flap, snap on you and instantly kill you like they can in Counter-Strike Source. It's really strange that they did that, but even so, they still have a bot to like charge across the map and shoot you on sight. It's a level of aggression you don't normally see in games. Usually in games, there's a lot of stuff just kind of standing around waiting on timers. And this goes all the way back to like Diablo 2, where enemies just have this long stall between actions. Now, in a bunch of these games, like say, for example, I believe DMC, is enemies kind of just actually become completely inactive when they're off camera. And you can, of course, game this and stuff like speedruns, but it also means you don't really need to pay attention to what's off camera. And that always is terrible, because there should be cues to what's going off camera, audio cues, so that you can track them. Otherwise, you don't have to really respect or pay attention. In other words, there's also, and I've seen tutorials to do this in Unreal 4, which I find disgusting. There's a lot of these games where if you have more than one enemy in an area, they use a script that governs their behavior, so only one enemy really does anything at a time, or maybe only two enemies does anything at a time, and their others just kind of like shut down until they get their turn. So in the end of the day, you do not have really much change in your interactions between one enemy and 6-7 enemies. You don't really need to respect them that much more. It's just more bodies. And
you're touching on a subject I think is really important as it pertains to AI. It's like a sub-subject, and it's something that I keep coming back to when I play RTS games mostly. But I think it's obvious, like you were just giving an example in like what I imagine is a more 3D ARPG style game or something like that, where basically I call it, when I describe it as the AI or the enemies pulling punches, and it's basically like, it might as well be the enemies not trying to win. Like they are not trying to win. And I feel like if you can try to conceptualize in a game,
like a puppet show.
Yeah. If you conceptualize the game's opponents as entities that want to claim victory, and in doing so, like they must defeat the player, that is infinitely more interesting than enemies that are just standing around waiting for the player to interact with them. And it's like a fundamental paradigm shift, or a difference of outlook between the developer who says it's actually intentional that there's just a grind wall here, or something that occupies the player's time, and sort of like has this hollowness to it, where it's just there to occupy the player so that they can say that they played a game, versus the kind of developer who says, no, like I conceptualize my AI opponents as competition, not occupation, if that makes sense. So could you talk a little bit about the way, because this is a deep subject in and of itself, is like the idea of AI trying to take victory, but there's different ways to do that. Like people will maybe take an uncharitable view of that subject and say, oh, you must mean AI that just have no limitations, that do just instantly pinpoint accuracy headshot you with a sniper in CSGO or whatever. Like you must be talking about an RTS AI that, like, if it doesn't cheat, it at the very least has like 1 million APM and never There's like, I feel like there are realistic and reasonable limitations you can put on AI to sort of, it's not just their personality, but also their presumed skill level if you could imagine a character being middling in skill or something. The specifics of how you would implement something like that are different from genre to genre, but it feels like it's possible to design AI that, while flawed in their approach in some way, are still trying to win, and that doesn't feel like an arbitrary difference or distinction or something. Could you talk a little bit about your approach to make it so that AI are trying to claim victory? They are trying to be proactive and aggressive and all these things, but have weaknesses associated with them that make it so that they aren't like just head and shoulders unkillable and above anything the player could ever do?
Well, I like to think that back to my times with pretty much any of these games that I've played competitively, Halo, UT, StarCraft, stuff like that. You have lots of mixed skill levels, and low-level players can still be aggressive. Absolutely. In fact, low-level players oftentimes tend to be more aggressive than a high-level player. That's one of the big differences that's going to be between like the mid-range, like golds into diamonds and stuff like that. And one of the reasons why people get stuck in what they call elo hell is they do not know how to curb their aggression. They get really full of themselves because they start taking wins. They start beating, less mechanically skilled players, and they start thinking they can be aggressive all the time. It doesn't work like that. People who know when to be aggressive will take much more advantage. And as a result, aggression is the thing I really focus on the most. When I think of an AI, I think less about technical accuracy. Now, it's true, I could just make them input read everything you do and avoid everything, but there's a reason why I brought up the Souls example of input reads on the parrying in particular, is because that's annoying to play against. Nobody really wants to play against that. Nobody really wants to play against an AI that's always going to dodge everything you do. The annoying thing is in some of these games, you get like heavy attacks or something like that, and it's almost impossible to land them because the AI is always going to get out of the way. And that's also why I mentioned having timings based on competitive players for fighting games and stuff like that. It's because I want to look at what a skilled player's reactions are actually like and how they make those reactions. And this is going to be a long thing for me to get into because I don't want to look at just a couple hours of videos and be like, okay, so, I've heard it can be as fast as 16 ms or 20 ms. Make everything 16 or 20. No, it's not going to work like that. It's going to be different for everything. And it's going to be variable. And when I think, look, with StarCraft AI in particular, it's difficult because one of the biggest things with StarCraft is economy. And the AI will never manage its economy in the shadow of a player whatsoever. And expecting the AI to manage its economy in the shadow of a player means your AI is always going to underperform. Unfortunately, one of the evils with StarCrafts and similar RTSs is the AI has to have some extra money because they're just going to underperform. Always. There will never be an AI that ever really performs quite as well as a player. And yes, there's tactical AI that will perfectly dance Marines, perfectly dance Melisks and stuff like that. And the second you turn it into a real game environment, we have real economy. If you have some kind of extremely specific, map-specific, point-by-point AI, which I have seen examples of where they have perfect everything, then yeah, you can take off money injections or increased income or whatever, and you can have something that can challenge a player in those specific matchups. But as a rule of thumb, when I design any given AI for any given project, I make them in specific to locations or maps. So one of the things that my Unreal project is going to do is avoid arenas for anything other than bosses. In titles like DMC or God of War, you go basically down a corridor, and each turn in the corridor has an arena that walls you off in that turn with enemies to fight. And you can't leave that. It's usually a very small arena. And I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to have something a little bit more like Dark Souls. This is one of the things I like about Dark Souls is the arena, while enemies leash in that game, and they don't really wander around that much, if at all, you still have an entire world environment. And if you have a ranged attack, you can really cheese that. But other than that, you can just kind of explore and move around, and enemies can, on paper, explore and move around too. That's the idea. So my stuff will not be rooted to any specific area. So they have to be able to navigate the map. And there will most certainly be cases where the player is going to be at a disadvantage against an AI because of how the map navigation will be different between the player and the AI, because the AI reads data, the player reads the map. They're very different. And that means that sometimes you might find yourself at a disadvantage because you're facing a computer that calculates stuff much faster than your brain takes in information and comprehends it. But the tools are available to find a more optimal location that fit your skills. The idea that I have when approaching the AI is to give the AI aggression, first and foremost. To make the AI feel as though you're fighting something that at least operates within similar reflexes to you. So that, for example, if the AI attempts to dodge one of your attacks, it's not going to do so because you push the button. It's going to do so because your ability actually produces a read. The AI sees the read, and then there is a delay that represents an actual thinking time representative of the actual character. So when I think of AI, I think I'm trying to create an opponent. I want to create an opponent that feels like an opponent, it's fighting to win, fighting to kill. And that means that that opponent can be prone to over-aggression. Sometimes the opponent is of a high skill level. Sometimes the opponent is of a low skill level. Sometimes the opponent is not very accurate. So my test monster has an attack that checks the player's position. It checks an area around the player's position. If it sees the player, it's going to target an area around the player's position. If you stand still, it's probably going to hit you. But it doesn't always center on you, and I avoid tracking projectiles in most cases as well, as opposed to Dark Souls where arrows for some reason have to track you. And it's just a very simple thing. But then we would see more ranged attacks, more aggressive ranged attacks. The AI will only attempt ranged attacks when you are at a range. The AI won't fire at walls, like in Doom, for example. It's not going to track you through walls. The AI may try to predict certain locations. I'd love to use EQS for the AI to fire at locations where I last saw you. That's a little too advanced for me at this time. I haven't gotten into EQS. But the idea is to make the AI at least perceivably behave as though it is thinking, as though it is either hunting or otherwise trying to kill you. And absolutely, you have the tools available to make the AI very unfair, where the AI will always perfectly input read your attacks. Right now, my AI, it can teleport. And I can very easily say, hey, the player has entered an attack. Let's feed a Boolean to the AI that flips on this teleport, and you just jump out of harm's way every single time. This is very easy to do. I'm not going to do it. Some AI may try to dodge or teleport out of your attacks with a delay, but generally speaking, when I look at the interactions, I have a line between, what constitutes as unfair and what feels challenging to fight against. And that's going to be completely subjective. It's going to be based entirely on my skill level. It's going to be one of the most subjective parts of the project, to be honest. I don't expect to have this in the hands of any potential playtesters for a very long time. And by the time I reach that point, we will most certainly have systems in the game that perceivably could be construed as unfair. And I am very much looking forward to seeing what some of the people that I talk to will perceive those systems as, because one of them is the person who's been aggressively pursuing high-level technical play in DMC3, and another person has very high-level technical play in arcade titles and stuff like that. I have access to some very distinct high-end skill sets that are completely detached from anything that I have. And their experiences are going to be very unique to look at this. But at the end of the day, I'm still looking for that experience that feels good to me. And I would like to think that most people who listen to me talk about AI would expect me to not produce something whose sole purpose is just to destroy the player. Haha, look at me. I can read all your inputs and avoid everything and have a perfect result every time. Obviously I had a lot of matches and in any of these games I've played up against where I was completely one-sided and I felt it was a fairly positive learning experience. But I still want there to always be a road to the player being able to work up to a skill level to improve, which means that if I have an opponent that thinks fast, reacts fast, acts fast, reads the map well, that's going to be an opponent that you do not face at a stage which you are unprepared for this kind of behavior. But first and foremost, the thing I want to define the AI is aggression. You can expect the enemy to be aggressive, and that is absolutely going to be something that anybody other than me or anybody other that isn't familiar with my projects is not going to be prepared for. If you are a high-end Souls player, I expect you to have a lot of problems right out of the gate with this project because the enemies in this move around, they hunt, And they will communicate, they will hear you, they will track you, and they will attack relentlessly until you or them are dead. Some may disengage when they're injured or whatever, but what you will expect is an enemy that doesn't stand around and wait for you to kill it. You have to make opportunities to kill it. You can capitalize on maybe something they do, like a heavy attack or something that missed you or whatever, bad positioning or some such. But you will be forced to actually actively think in this as if you were playing a competitive game, as if you were really in a situation where you are fighting an opponent that is in a life or death situation with you as their opponent. And that's what I want you to feel when you're fighting this, is that aggression. I want you to feel like your opponent is dangerous. I want you to respect your opponent. And I can do that without making them perfect. I can do that without the StarCraft equivalent of feeding them tons of money and feeding them all their upgrades and pre-placing 800 food of units on the map. I can make them start off with the same command center and the same 4 SCVs that you do. I can still make them feel aggressive without adjusting their build speeds or spawning extra units or doing any of this other shit. I can make them feel like they're going to be a challenging opponent to you, even without even giving them any extra money. All they have to do is build the units, attack you with those units, expand, do the things that you do. Do the things that you could see that you do. Do the things that make logical sense to you to do, even if you are not at that skill level. Even if you're not good at managing your economy and spending your money, your enemy is. In order to beat them, I'm going to have to learn how to play the game a little bit better. That's the interaction I want.
So when you're thinking about, again, this idea of engaging the player fully in a, like you referenced the ball and how there's an enemy that, like, I mean, it's not very complex. Surely there's dials you could turn to make the interactions more interesting or to build on those interactions. But the baseline experience of getting pursued infinitely and tirelessly by a monster that just doesn't stop is still something that stuck with you all these years later since your playthrough of that game. So how do you intend to build upon that in a sense that, like, you've got this AI framework, you've got the idea of aggression, you've got some of these like core principles of what would define an opponent in this title. How would you go about building more interesting things on that, increasing the difficulty almost through the variety of things as opposed to necessarily like numbers or statistics or what people would mostly think of what difficulty does. Like if you imagine a difficulty slider, in most games that's just a multiplier for health or damage. But I have a feeling that, judging by all the things I've seen of this title so far, your experience of trying to give the player something more difficult to deal with would actually be from, I would imagine, move sets and certain tools that the enemy has, and changing the guard that way. How would you describe what a more difficult opponent looks like relative to a more basic one that you were just describing earlier?
So one of the things you're going to see in most of these titles is you have, other than maybe a boss, you have enemies that are defined by a gimmick. So a very common one is the fodder enemy. It's like, let's think of an example. In God of War, I forget what they're called. I think it was God of War Ascension. It was an absolute mess of a game. And they had they were goats, right? I don't know. Let's say they're goats. You had a basic goat, and the goat has a sword. The goat attacks you with a sword. That's kind of it. And then maybe you have a shield goat. The shield goat's gimmick is that he has a shield. And if I remember, it's been a long time, I don't really remember, but for the sake of example, the shield is something that deflects your attacks until you destroy the shield or use a quick time event to pull it off. And then after that, the goat is just effectively another goat. So its gimmick is a shield. It's defined by the shield. And this is something you see in all these games. You have the fast, small enemy. You have the big, fat, slow enemy that does more damage and has more health. And then you have the ranged enemy. You have enemies that are defined by single-sided characteristics. These gimmicks, these behaviors. And then they kind of almost look at them as like a hard counter perspective, where one is melee, one is ranged. You counter melee with ranged in some cases. A lot of these games actually tend to defer away from ranged because their AI isn't aggressive enough to really take advantage of it. God of War is really bad for this. And you have the ranged enemies who really don't do anything in melee. And it makes the combat very predictable. Very, very, very predictable. When I look at my opponents, obviously movesets are a big deal. Now, with Dark Souls, one of the things that makes the bosses at least stand out from comparative titles is the fact that, generally speaking, they have a rotation, but the rotation can consist of many different movesets. Some of these movesets can be like Pontiff Sullivan's short sword that has collision behind the sword for some reason. It's kind of really annoying. But as an idea, it is there. They can do different things. And that means that you do have a fair learning curve to learning what these different things are. But the different characteristics of these attacks, although it still amounts to effectively, as Simon says, because it's basically a quick time event of rolling around, they're still different patterns, let's say. So a title that I played a while ago that I remember fairly fondly in spite of the great difficulty I had with it was R-Type 3. And shmups and everything to come after it, and bullet hells, if you will, they're defined in many parts by patterns. Once you reach a point in these games and skill level, what separates a lot of the fights in these is going to be the patterns, the projectile patterns. And it becomes quite technical. And when you think about patterns, you almost think of movesets, because some of these fights, especially in the higher difficulties, some of the special stuff, they can be very long with many different patterns, many different things you've got to do in them. You might struggle a lot with one really difficult portion, but be able to deal with another one. In many cases, I feel like a lot of people look at action games and what enemies do too much from the sense of what the individual gimmicks are, rather than how they use them. And one of the things that I would do to introduce difficulty into the project is zoning. So, like I mentioned, a lot of these titles tend to be very arena-centric, with the exception of like Dark Souls. And these arenas usually will consist of you basically running around with some enemies chasing you, either cutting them around and chiseling them down, or utilizing crowd control to stun them all and grind them down, or some mixture of using crowd control to deal with the numbers, circling around an arena, either collecting pickups like ammunition or health, or otherwise just you smacking enemies until their health is dead. If you are at a disadvantage either for skill stats or some other reason, it usually amounts to you running around the arena trying to find some opening to make something happen. And the enemies very often tend to just sort of single-mindedly either chase you around to whatever extent they chase, or they might sit there and shoot at you or whatever. There's something lacking, and that is the opponents attempting to play the map. So when you go into arena shooters, when you go into something like Quake, or even Halo PC, or Unreal Tournaments, you have fixed positions on the map for pickups, ammunition, armor, health, stuff that you need to have an advantage. Playing the map effectively means knowing where these are, knowing what the respawns are, being able to take control of these assets, and also denying the enemy player these assets as well. You may be at 49 armor, and the armor will only take you to 50, but if you take that armor, your opponent cannot take that armor. You've denied them that armor. That's important. Now we can think of League of Legends again. Zoning. If you are in a lane against an opponent, and the opponent has a significant advantage against you for whatever reason, either he's been playing a lot better than you are, or he's got an item lead on you, or maybe you're scared of his jungler being nearby or something like that, you can't get close to the minion wave to get your last hits and you can't get your money. There is a disadvantage being amounted to that, because now he's evidently inside the minion wave and taking creep score, and you're not. If you are forced away from the minion wave, you are being zoned. You're being zoned away. Zoning is like the enemy has map control over you. That can be because they placed damage volumes there, because there is a threat from you entering the domain. Maybe they have a gap closer, or you think they're going to burn their flash or something on top of you, or you think the jungler is going to jump on you, whatever. You can't get close to it for whatever reason. That means you're being zoned from it. What we don't see in single player games is this kind of behavior. We don't see those kinds of interactions. We don't see you being zoned out of something, and as is also often the case, you do not gain advantage or do not have the ability to zone things out. So I recently played a really, really crummy shooter called Doom Eternal. And in this shooter, there is a very large fat enemy, because they always have to have these very large fat enemies that move around that are slow. But the enemy has an interesting ability that its attacks produce jizz on the ground. And if you stand in the jizz, in the sand by 50 sand, you will take damage. This jizz is the perfect tool for zoning. They don't do anything with it in the game besides blindly shoot at you with it, so nothing can be accomplished with it. But the really obvious thing that stood out to me that could have been accomplished with it is they read the map. They know that you went into this corridor. There's only two ways out of this corridor, either the front or the back. What would you do with an ability that creates damage volumes? You would shoot the front and the back and corner them or cut them off so that they either had to go in a direction or they had to take time to deal with this map effect you've created, either by jumping over it or trying to find some other solution. And that gives you time to catch up, or your allies time to catch up. You can zone portions of the map. You can zone the pickups. There's so many different things you could do with his weapon other than just blindly shoot at the player and just, like every other thing, either lead the player through walls or just blindly fire at them until you hit them. Zoning, it never crossed their minds. Never crossed their minds because they really just weren't even thinking about the game when they were designing this. They just want to make a quick buck. But this kind of behavior, it makes sense to any player who plays these kinds of games, anybody who actually plays games, is, hey, I have something that creates a huge area of damage. I don't necessarily need it to land on the player. I can use it to control the player. And I can control the player without taking away their controls. A lot of the things that people will do with this stuff is, let's stun the player. Let's take away their controls completely. Slow them down. Nerf them in some manner. I like to think as if I can avoid ever having to take away control from the player without through use of the stagger system that I haven't really employed yet, then I may never even add that. I may never even have the ability to stun the player in the game at all. If I can get away without having stuns in the game, that's brilliant, beautiful. But beyond that, I'll never stun the player. I'm never going to take away your controls. I'm never going to remove pieces of your moveset just because. Once you've got something, you've got it. No, I'm not going to say suddenly you can't jump. Suddenly you can't dash. Suddenly you can't attack with this weapon. Suddenly you can't move. It's lazy. And it's impossible to balance on top of it. So I look at the dimension that makes sense to me as a player that I don't see anybody taking advantage of, which is playing the map control, zoning. So a more intelligent opponent, this is where the EQS, the environment query system, would really come in handy, but that involves math and, like I said, numbers. I have an aversion to numbers for many reasons, and one of them being I'm just not very intelligent. Numbers, yeah, EQS is going to be a long thing, but I would like for the AI to see you go into a corridor or someplace it can't see and try to zone you in there, try to zone your way out. Think about where you might go, come up with a list of possibilities, use this range of text to shoot at those locations. Like, say, for example, you're playing UT, you've got the rocket launcher, someone just rounded a corner in front of you. You can't shoot him anymore, you don't see him anymore, but you know that corner goes out this hole into this jump. There's a very good chance that they're going to jump there. At least a 50-50 chance they're either going to try to feint and come back out and shoot you, or they're going to jump out the other side and do whatever from that side. Why not shoot a rocket into that side? You might just hit them. You even see that in those Counter-Strike videos you linked, where there's only so many places somebody's going to go. You see them blindly firing into the smoke because somebody might just turn and go there. That's the player thinking, the player might come in here. I might get some hits in. Let's take the shots. And even if you don't hit them, they see the shots, or at least they hear the shots coming in. They know that if they walk in, then they are going to get hit. They're zoned from that hallway anyways. You're still indirectly controlling their movements, and you're doing that without stunning them, without dealing damage to them. You're just presenting a threat. So I'd like to think of more opponents not only having more potential tools to their advantage that don't necessarily have more direct power, but different ways of dealing damage. So what I would like to point out with my project is that right now, with my idea, the player has 10 health. That's it. You don't increase your health as time goes on. You just got to play better. And most things will only deal 1 damage. But there's many different ways you could potentially take damage. The evident one would be something hits you with an arrow or a projectile or takes a swipe at you. The stagger system, you might take stagger damage without actually taking physical damage, or vice versa. And I don't want enemies to necessarily deal damage faster, but to deal damage with different ways. Having these damage volumes on the ground from some projectile they launched, artillery, some other ambient effect, some way of playing the environment, maybe bouncing projectiles off of walls or something else you can pay attention to. Other than just having them deal more damage, deal damage faster. When I think of difficulty is expressed in large part through utility. The more utility something has, the more powerful it has the potential to become, with stuns and loss of control evidently being one of the strongest forms of utility expression. So we try to avoid giving that to players because that will always feel bad. It always feels bad to lose your control. It always feels bad to be unable to do anything, to be unable to even try to do anything. So a more advanced opponent might be more likely to try to zone you. It might be more likely to try to read off of something its allies are doing. Like if my allies are shooting at me and am I going to shoot too? If you avoid their projectiles, you're probably going to avoid my projectile too. Maybe I will choose to attack and just close distance while my allies are shooting and instead, just behavioral changes. I like to look at those interactions and think of how a player might look at it and be like, what would the more skilled player do? And I'll need more points of reference for that, which means I'm going to need to do some more studying of high level play of some of these games and really understand what really draws the line and the nuances in a way that can be applied to the AI, because those things that players will do that you really can't bring into the AI world. But managing how that aggression is applied and how they play the map is certainly the most important part. A blind, dumb enemy may just chase you, and you can just bring them into an area that is advantageous to you. Are you struggling with their ranged attacks? Bring them into an area that has cover. If an enemy is going to be a little bit more intelligent, they may be more resistant to coming in that area. They might try to choose a point to camp or a point where they have vision over the exit points of where you're hiding, and then they might choose to wait instead. So those are some ideas that I would have, that I would attempt to employ to adjust how the difficulty is applied, for sure.
We keep coming back to the idea of enemies that play the map, and it's an interesting subject to me because of the fact that I feel like very few games really fully actualize the idea that it's even important for the human player to play the map, let alone the AI. So, in what ways do you think will your level design in a 3D environment where AI and the player are expected to play the map to take advantage of it, what ways will the maps themselves differ from others? And are there examples of maybe not fully actualized but still interesting levels from some of these other ARPG games like the Souls games line or Devil May Cry, where there were you mentioned that arenas were really common in the games that aren't Souls, but still the idea of battlegrounds that are actually interesting, that would lend themselves to the sort of map playing that you're describing. Are there any examples you can think of from a title that's already out there that might help concretize the example or the idea in the minds of the listener?
Well, one thing I want to have is Z levels. Z is avoided in all these games because, to be quite frank, the developers are just too lazy to have jumping in their AI. And it's very, very simple to do. Very, very simple to do. The most basic form of jumping is a smart nav link that tells the AI to jump up a ledge. You don't even have to have a jumping animation, just something that helps them navigate. And we see this bits and pieces again in the Doom reboots. They have a few of these nav links, but they're only in very specific locations. This is pretty bad. But that's what I want to do, is I want to have some Z to the game. Different levels that you and the platforms or whatever, not even necessarily being above or below, but just not a big empty room. And as for examples of that, honestly, I have a hard time really thinking about that. I think that Dragon's Dogma is also a fairly open game, and aesthetically speaking, I would like to replicate Dragon's Dogma in many ways. My goal is to make my project at least look as good as Dragon's Dogma. And Dragon's Dogma just uses a bunch of like photo textures or whatever, but it has an aesthetic to it, particularly once you remove the depth of field and other stuff like that, that just modern games really just don't get close to for some reason. They don't really try to make their textures high resolution or appealing anymore. They'd rather hide stuff behind screen space and temporal. And Dragon's Dogma also doesn't really have forced arenas for the most part. And there are some Z level areas like the towers in Bitter Black, but the AI cannot navigate those at all, and it turns into a huge mess. So I wouldn't really use those as an example. I honestly can't really think of too many existing examples. With Souls, the second that they have levels without barriers, their AI tends to just walk off and instantly kill itself. So there's interesting, like what I kind of like about Souls aesthetically speaking is castle areas, and that's something I visit a lot within my project as well. Is large sprawling castles. The problem with Souls is you can't access most of the world that you can see. It's still very much a corridor for the most part. And I would like my world to be more explorable or more open. I have mantling and double jumping, other stuff in it. And my rule of thumb is that anywhere the player can be expected to navigate quickly, the AI should also be able to expect it to navigate quickly. And given my graphical limitations, it probably won't look very pretty when they do so. But the end experience should still be fairly consistent, in which, hey, if I can jump up to this ledge, my opponents can find a way up here too. And they should be able to do it fairly quickly. And that alone is going to set a very different kind of precedent, where in most of these games you can just jump up and down a ledge and the AI will just spend the entire time navigating all the way around wherever the ramp is, because they're too lazy to put a nav link to just jump up there. And it's always extremely comical every single time that happens. I have to point it out every single time it happens because it's always so incredibly goofy. The technology to do this is ancient. We've seen it in DMC 1. Enemies will jump up ledges in DMC 1, and suddenly that just doesn't seem to exist in 90% of the games to come after it. We really just don't see it anymore. It's so fucking baffling. But that's reality is often stranger than fiction. And unfortunately, DMC 1, with some of those areas with enemies that can jump up ledges, has got some interesting stuff in it. But, beyond aesthetics in terms of gameplay, the only stuff I can really think of, I can really point you towards, is look at Unreal Tournament and Quake maps and stuff like that, but think of them without jump pads. Think of them as though your moveset, it's what's navigating you around. And your opponents are navigating around with similar movesets to some extent. And maybe some can teleport or whatever, but it's still very much large, sprawling areas with multiple levels to them. Maybe walls, floors, underbellies, canyons, something like that. It'll be a foreign concept to most people who play these, but once you get into it, it just all kind of just makes sense, right? It's just a very large arena. The whole world is your arena. That's the idea.
One of the interesting paradoxes that comes from conceptualizing the entire playable level as an arena or as a battleground or something important is that you're trying to go for this large scale environment. I assume it'll be quite large scale. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit. But if I think back to the RTS levels I've created recently, it's like, on the one hand, I want to spend all of this time creating interesting spaces where decisions can be made to gain an advantage by leveraging not just the toolkit you have as an RTS player with your race or whatever, but also the environment itself. So you can do that if you focus your attention on the micro scale, the smaller scale. But then there's also the artistry that's at play in connecting these interesting areas of the map to each other in interesting ways. And in a 3D environment where you actually do have a Z level and you have this navigation with jumping and teleporting and these other moves, that becomes it's literally another dimension to the level design, where now it's required that you connect these ideas or these areas that have interesting ideas in them. You have to connect it across the Z axis as well as the X and Y axes. And then you have to do that in interesting ways that don't like ruin or sap at the quality of the interesting ideas you already have. And then, there's a lot of pressure, it feels like, or maybe pressure is the wrong word, but if you're going to set the expectation that the whole world is an interesting arena, they have to be different ideas, but you still have to be able to cogently impart these ideas in a way that is capable of being interfaced with by the player and also by the AI, as you're referencing with the idea of navigating the world. So I know this is a relatively new subject for you to get into, is this 3D level design stuff. Have you started to build any habits or strong opinions about what kind of components might make an interesting area of a map, and then also how to link it together in a way that's interesting. You were referencing, for example, the Dark Souls castle areas as a compelling ideas. How have you started to shape your worlds as far as like in-game areas go?
Well, I think the first and most important part is again starting off with the right concept and the right footing. And that means, again, my AI isn't hard pointed to waypoints or scripts based on the map. My whole idea is to have everything built in such a way where I can take it and drag and drop it literally anywhere. It's just like StarCraft AI. You take your campaign AI for Artanis and Fuda Kerrigan, and you just drop them on a map completely unrelated to whatever campaign map you had them on, and they will build and do everything they were supposed to do. It's precisely the same idea. They're free-flowing, completely adapted to anything you throw on there. With this is will have to set up some navigation data for them, like the smart links for jumping or stuff like that. But the idea is to start off with something that will change to any change you make. With the actual levels themselves, I actually think I'm going to struggle a little bit more with dealing with a camera than anything. So one of the most major things of this project, as far as the player is concerned, that separates it from all the other titles, is this is not a console port. All these other ARPGs, Souls or otherwise, are console ports. And they use something called lock-on. What lock-on does is it attaches your camera to an enemy. And this is because controlling the camera with a controller is awkward as hell. And dealing with directional movement and directional combat without it is even more problematic. So the boilerplate solution is lock-on cameras. And even for PC native titles to derive from these, they've just always sort of accepted this, with a handful of exceptions. Some Star Wars games actually do not do this. They use a free camera, and I am using a free camera. All of your attacks and your movement is based on your camera orientation. Your mouse will control your direction, and you have some root motion within your attacks that helps you orient yourself and push forward and during attacking and stuff like that. But otherwise, all of your movement is controlled through your mouse. It's very different than Dark Souls, very different than DMC, very different than all these other. It's God of War I played without lock-on. I can't remember if God of War has lock-on. It probably does. But God of War I was able to play without lock-on. And it always felt better. The combat always felt a little bit better in that than in DMC, even though the actual content wasn't as good. And I actually went through all of Demon Souls without lock-on at all because I didn't realize how ridiculously overpowered lock-on is in that game. And I used a spear for most of it. So I probably played Demon Souls the hardest so you could play it. And it's still, honestly, despite how awkward it was, especially with a controller, that was the way I always felt like it should have been played. And then, of course, at the end of the game, when I really struggled a lot with the instant hit and visible collision and death and just the grossness of the final Boletaria zone, I decided to try a lock-on. I was messing around with Old King Dorn and the Knights and stuff like that. And I was like, this actually trivializes the entire game. I would have never have had the difficulties with it that I did have if I just used lock-on from the start. But I always hated lock-on because it changes your movement. Now you're moving around the axis of an enemy. It always felt awkward as hell. My project won't use this. But the flip side is that your camera, when you have all this different geometry and you're in a more sometimes closed space or more complex space, I'm going to have to either acquire or devise a camera system that sort of tries to avoid thrashing against stuff. And the biggest issue I'm having right now is if I have a bunch of pillars, the camera tends to get really angry with them. And I can bounce between them and it kind of jerks the camera around. And there's nothing more frustrating to me in dealing with these games than something that fights the camera. You have the camera in a spot. You want it in that spot. Anything that fucks around with it is going to be something you don't want to deal with. Is going to disrupt you a lot. And one of the major frustrations I had with Dark Souls 3 is the same button that locks onto enemies also inverts your camera. And lock-on has a very short distance in Dark Souls 3, and any of them really. So it's very often you try to lock onto an enemy and it just flips your camera around instead. Absolutely horrendous. nobody ever played these games when they were making them, so they never actually thought to fix that all the way up until Bloodborne, apparently. And I guess Elden Ring will also carry over Bloodborne settings for that, where you can actually change the hotkey. But Dark Souls 3, not so much. So it was really frustrating, really annoying. And this would break lock-on if enemies just so much as go behind like a railing, like a small little object. The second they go out of line of sight, oh, your lock-on's gone. Try to reacquire lock-on, camera gets thrashed around. You might just die for the effort. So there is no lock-on in this at all. I won't even support controllers. So that means that your camera is much more free-flowing. You almost think of it as like World of Warcraft in a way. But your control mechanisms are a little bit different. And if the camera gets hooked in geometry, it's going to be an issue. So cameras are actually one of the more complicated and technical things within the game. You may not really think of it, but the camera is almost like its own AI system you have to kind of devise. And it's a fairly advanced subject I haven't really looked into. But third-party solutions are quite expensive because it is a fairly major integral part of the game. You get a lot of job security out of having a good asset for a camera. So I would like to try to at least try to build a solution myself before I think about anything else with it. And when it comes to the levels and being able to read what's going on and stuff like that, that to me concerns me a lot more than the actual gameplay in itself. Because I think so long as I have an opponent that consistently performs relatively well and challenges the player in any environment, then as I go through those environments and build them, I will just innately figure out what amounts to the most consistent experience through them. I have a very run and gun development style. I don't really like planning too much ahead because chances are when I get to the point that I'm actually building this stuff, I'm going to come up with a better idea, or I'm going to end up abandoning whatever it was I was thinking of doing to begin with because, well, I don't really feel like it anymore. So I'm not the kind of guy who's going to be like, I'm going to design a castle or a level. Let's write out all the bullet points and major stuff I want to. No, I'm just going to go in there, unzip my pants, and start swinging my dick around and see whatever sticks. And along the way, I will figure out things that I don't like or things that I do like or whatever. One of the things I do like is I like having big scale. I like having a large area, maybe with small components in it and tighter areas, but I like having a large area, maybe not necessarily a large open area, but a large area. I like there to be scale on stuff. And then one of the things I'm thinking about is, okay, so let's say we're in the later half of progression of that zone. Most of our opponents are probably dead and dealt with. Do we really want the player navigating this massive area in their normal movement speed? And I thought maybe I might give them a transform or something that turns them into an animal that can move a little faster or have other options. And then that led me to thinking about, okay, so we have this ability that transforms you into an animal. We don't really want to travel for them. That's goofy. What if it's something we can integrate into the combat system or something the players can choose to integrate into combat systems to navigate around stuff faster? That also might be interesting because it has its own risk-reward factor. So I'm not at the stage where I'm into implementation for this idea, but when I get these ideas, I don't necessarily dismiss them like I might in something else because I'm in uncharted territory. You never know what these ideas might present. You never know what kind of considerations they might add to the table. So at some point, I am going to attempt to implement this idea, and I may end up scrapping it. And as a result, I may end up adding or changing ways I approach level design in general as a result of these changes. So it's hard to predict a lot of stuff, but more and more and more, the more I get into it, the more I look at building these 3D levels and stuff like that, is the more I realize I have to throw out all the conceptions I've built by playing these other games because I have already built a system, as simple and as basic as it is. I've already built a system that far outpaces what you could accomplish in those games. I can already do things you can't do in those games because their system would not behave in it. Just having ledges, Z levels, bridges, whatever. Fucking StarCraft 2 doesn't even have collision meshes. Like, you can't even do stuff in StarCraft 2 that was basic in Unreal Tournament 99. So you don't even have 3D collision. The fucking movers are a hack. Air units are a hack. You can't even, unless you build your own like physics system in triggers. God, the people who do that, I gotta applaud them for their masochism, their love for pain and self-flagellation. This lunacy. But that's what you would need to do to have an under and over bridge is hacks and boilerplates. And you can't even use those systems in modern games because the AI won't navigate. It won't jump up ledges. They don't have the framework in for something as simple as smart links. It's one of the first fucking things I did in Unreal was figure out smart links so the AI can jump up and down ledges. Now I have these huge walls with the top of the wall and the interior of the wall. My dudes will jump up them. They'll jump down them. They'll go anywhere you want around them, just like the player will. And that means that I can no longer reference old material for thinking, I want to make a castle like in Dark Souls. No, my castles are going to be played completely differently than Dark Souls. That means that while I could look at Dark Souls as, hey, this would be cool to do, the actual resulting product is already going to be tremendously different just because of how the AI navigates it without even thinking about the player.
This brings me back to the original idea of that I started off this conversation with, which was the concept of a thought frontier and exploring at the sort of edges of current understanding as far as your personal journey in game design, if you want to call it that. And you also spoke at length about the camera and how that was a primary concern for you. I personally have not really seen a game that has done third-person camera well, in the sense that I feel like it would have been better. Like, okay, so I'll explain what I think the big flaw of third-person camera is, and you can tell me what you think. Maybe it's something you'll have an interesting observation on. Because for me, I can see justification for first-person because that's like a more intimate idea than like an RTS over the like God's eye view or whatever, isometric view. And I could see a justification for an isometric camera because then you have all these details, right? And so there's like obviously a push and pull between those two. But in third person, it feels like you don't get the accuracy and the freedom of movement in a third, like a three-dimensional environment and all that stuff of you don't have as precise, accurate sort of reads and visuals as you do in first person, but you also don't have like the breadth of being able to see as wide an area as you do in an isometric view. And so it feels like it's this sort of mediocre, like worst of both worlds, or like not really getting the benefits of either. And, because part of your screen is obscured by the character, which means that now you've got pressure to like have a very minimalist user interface. Otherwise you have even less screen space. Yeah. But then there's also the idea of like, okay, then there's camera inaccuracy and it runs up against terrain. So it poses a lot of problems. And also in your case, it was the source of a great amount of grief, I imagine, about the player character. Whereas if it was just a first-person game, you wouldn't have as much of a benefit. I mean, if you have a lot of mirrors, then you still need it. But like the idea of it being so important to make sure everything was like nailed down would probably have taken some of the pressure off of that particular asset development. So why have you chosen to stick with a third-person camera? And what do you think it brings? Because I personally haven't been able to find as much of a value add. So what do you think the third person over the shoulder camera adds to the experience of playing one of these types of games?
Well, this game isn't really over the shoulder. Over the shoulder is more like Warframe or Gears of War. There's a more closer camera. And over the shoulder, I think, is a really weak camera system in general. It's you're really tied up. You're really up the character's ass without actually being able to see your ass, which means that attacks coming from the side are really hard to read if there are no audio cues. And audio design hasn't been something games have really pursued for a long time now. So that's when you enter the cases of like, oh, enemies off screen should be less aggressive because the player doesn't see them coming. It is absolutely a challenge for sure. 3D is a disaster. And with pretty much every genre, there's no reason to take 3D because you enter an arena where you stand to lose a lot of readability. Graphical fidelity is lower in 3D than in 2D. And what do you gain out of it? In most cases, not too much. And I will say over the years, of course, I've dealt a lot with shooters, not nearly as much as RTS, but, making a shooter project as opposed to a third-person project most certainly has crossed my mind many cases. I'm not familiar with first-person animations or modeling guns or anything of that nature. It's what I actually really wanted to make, beyond just like a DMC clone, is actually like a Dragon's Dogma clone. But that would be It's effectively the same thing, but there's a lot more layers to it to make that basically a replication of the pawn system would be extremely challenging. And then you're talking about like an actual RPG with an inventory and stuff, and that's too big of a bite for me to take off. Like I had within 2 months from nothing, I had all the frameworks of everything I'm talking about right now, and yeah, I wouldn't have been anywhere near that if I was aiming for something as tall as Dragon's Dogma. But with my camera, it's a little different than the other titles because the other titles tend to have a fixed distance. And again, you're using a lock-on system on top of it, which means very often you do not even have control over the camera at all. The camera is pointing in the direction of your lock-on target. What I'm hoping is that because this is a free camera, more like what you would expect of something like, again, World of Warcraft, is a lot of the struggles you would have with, like, say, a limited field of view or whatever, you can alleviate by actually having full control of your camera through your mouse. So it feels a little more natural. Now, that said, you still are looking at a view that is dominated by the player character. You can zoom out in this. But when you're in a tight space, zooming out, you're going to have the camera ramming into walls. Again, I would love to have some sort of smart obstacle avoidance. I know that they can exist, and it most certainly can be brought into Unreal. And there are third-party systems for it. I'm just not willing to pay for them. And it's something that I actually intend to kind of read up on soon and see if I can figure out if there's any kind of like cheap, basic bitch solution I can throw in and see how that plays. With a project like this, if I can't figure out a solution, then I tend to maybe get a little heavy-handed in how I might try to solve it. You might even see me abandon this and go into a first-person shooter. You never know. But I think it's unlikely because I think I can make it work. And the thing is, it's more likely is why I brought that up with the level design discussion is because it falls into level design for sure. And you get into closed spaces, and there's going to be underground tunnels. And again, the area I'm having problems with is the area is full of poles. Is the camera will get hitched between the poles as you're going past them. If you have a camera at a certain point, you can't manually move your camera away from them. Well, what if I wanted to look in that direction? So I might have to split the poles off of objects and change their collisions so they do not collide with the camera anymore. What that means now is the camera can actually go inside of the geometry, and that kind of looks kind of ugly. But maybe you'll have a system, because you can have a system where if something goes between you and the camera, it becomes transparent. And that to me always looked really ugly as fuck. But if that's what I have to do to avoid the worst of both worlds, then maybe that's a compromise I have to make. I don't like compromises. I prefer elegant solutions. And in most cases, the elegant solutions are going to be, I'm going to have to change how my level is built and how the camera collision for that level is built as well, because they can be two completely different things. We can have a level that's full of spikes and shit all over the place, and maybe the camera just can't get between those at all. That's one thing you can do. So when you're talking about like the 3-dimensional levels and it being an increased dimension, there's actually, it's even more than just increase the dimensions. It's because I'm having a free camera. God of War is a fixed camera, and DMC is like mostly a fixed camera. And Dark Souls is a free camera with lock-on and stuff like that. All these have their own sorts of benefits. With a fixed camera, you don't have to worry about any of this shit. But also, your control scheme changes all over the place, and it can be a little awkward to get precision out of it. And of course, transitions between fixed cameras tends to be awkward. So I never really even hinted at wanting that, even though it's the easier system to design around for your content. And absolutely, there will have to be concessions made at so many points. And what this means ultimately is that the levels that are going to come out of this, they're not going to be very realistic. I mean, that's not a realistic world to begin with. We're playing like a furry, and we're stabbing interdimensional cosmic horrors. And we're using a weapon that can change shapes at will. Nothing really was ever realistic about it. But in the way in which we design our levels, it will probably resemble an arena shooter at the end of the day, despite being larger scale, than it does an actual real-world castle, for example, as a comparison. And if that concession is what allows us to have a very consistent experience, then that's the concession that we make. Because realism is a trap. If you try to design all these super tight corridors that are really, really claustrophobic, like real worlds, like aqueducts and catacombs would be like, then even if we figure out the camera solution, the actual character engagement solution is going to be really awkward. Kind of like with Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of the practiced Dungeons and Dragons dungeons are like one tile wide corridors in huge winding mazes. And I never found that interesting, especially to build actual maps around. So I have pretty much never done that, other than the third-party assets that I've used for that, which are few and far in between. I always avoid those kinds of assets. So the a lot of conventions I'm just intentionally breaking because to me as a player, they're not interesting. But also, we do take into account that, yeah, this is a 3D system. We're going to struggle a lot with it in many ways, and the camera's going to be one of them. And it's a 3D environment. And we're going to, again, have to make concessions with that, and it's going to be challenging to make it play well, for sure. And I absolutely agree that third-person cameras in general, I'm not too fond of them in most cases. At the best, I'll find them like really acceptable, as long as they don't get in my way, as long as it's easy enough to tell where my enemies are and what I'm doing and what I'm looking at, as long as the camera doesn't fight me. The worst part is if the camera fights you. If you're trying to do something in the camera, for some reason, like, again, the lock-on, flipping the camera in Dark Souls 3 is the worst part of it. Other than that, I was able to get through Dark Souls. I didn't really feel like it was fighting me too much, except for those cases. If I can get that kind of consistency, which shouldn't be too difficult, then that's a good starting point. So that's really going to be across a bridge when we get there. But I think that being able to zoom in and out on your own, which is something that you really can't do in most of these titles, having a non-fixed camera should allow you as a player to use your camera in a manner that feels at least as fluent as it does in something like World of Warcraft. And I know most people don't look at World of Warcraft from a positive viewpoint, but I think that's something that Blizzard has done well in their titles fairly consistently, at least up until somewhat modern times, is control systems. And the camera is a part of that. And World of Warcraft's camera, to me, maybe not necessarily a golden standard, but in most, I would say like 80-90% applicable cases that I have experienced, and I've experienced all game content from beta till like the end of Warlords of Draenor, to me, that has endured the test of time. And it's simple, and it works. And if I can make something simple that just works, then I'm not going to be looking for any extra bells and whistles on top of it.
So you sort of touched on towards the end there, you were referencing level design even in a D&D context and how sometimes it can be very cramped. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about D&D, and it kind of contrasts pretty heavily with what we were just talking about with the Unreal project.
Absolutely.
Where you're in this exploration phase where you're still not 100% sure about all these things. I asked you about level design and camera controls, and you said in some ways you have to cross the bridge when you come to it. It's too early to call. But on the D&D side of things, you're approaching the end of a very long campaign, and it's just like it must have been the third one or something to that effect, where it's it's not your first rodeo either. So can you talk to me a little bit about how you think the experience you've had running these sorts of games has influenced your take on more immediately interactive media? Because you and we've talked about D&D and the difference between like pen and paper, these sort of RPGs, the difference between that kind of media, the role-playing aspect, and then the more immediate reaction digital aspect, where there's, to some degree, games are always going to be linear, and the ways that they can be interesting is more how dynamic they are versus how static they are. Whereas to really have something that's non-linear, that can go any direction the players decide to take it, that's the kind of environment you step into with D&D. How have you been influenced with running these sorts of games? And has it really made much of a distinction as to how you tackle the more digital landscape of an interactive game? Or do you view them as very different things that sort of what happens in D&D stays in D&D in that respect? How would you describe the overall takeaways you've started to build up as you're winding down your most recent campaign?
I think one of the most educational things a game designer can have when it comes to the testing process of a project in regards to third parties is video. If you are in the process of building a game or a mod or anything that requires a third party to interact with it, do your damnedest to get them to record video of them doing it and send it to you unprocessed. Because are so few people who are going to be able to explain to you anything that they're doing, anything that they were thinking, or recall to you in any depth of their mindsets behind any given thing that they were interacting with your project. You'll be, in most cases, in my experience, you'll be lucky to get any meaningful feedback at all. Like my D&D players, they really don't give me much feedback. But when I run these games through Roll20, which is a very awkward Reddit meme platform that has successfully managed to introducing more bugs every single week or 2 weeks for years. It's actually really quite fascinating that they managed to do this, but they do. And that means that we're sitting there, we're typing in text, and I watch this in real time. And that was, and it still remains to this day, a very thoroughly educational experience in ways I had never imagined. It's even hard for me to even describe. I've built projects for a long time, a very, very long time, since 1998. And I've had other people playing my projects for a very long time. And I had never even imagined how valuable it would be to be able to watch them play it, to be able to observe their process. Now, for a commercial developer, you can bring in testers and have this, but I think most commercial developers don't even appreciate how valuable this information really actually is. Because if you're able to get people to vocalize what it is they're thinking or doing on top of it, then you've really hit gold. And you're not going to get most people to be able to vocalize very well. As I said, it's most people don't even know how to if they wanted to. With D&D, it's the vocalizations that are driving the content, and it's driving your actions as a result. It is absolutely very, very detached from, Unreal 4, StarCraft, anything that I've worked otherwise. But there's so many things you can still take from it. Again, I like to look at the genres and the interaction mechanisms as their own almost nebulous concept, things that stand alone. And one of the things that stands alone with D&D is how people absorb information and how they process information and then what they take away from the information. So you do not get the kind of reads that you do in D&D that you would within StarCraft. You don't get those audio cues or whatever. I mean, depending on the platform, I guess you can put them in, but you can't really abstract them the same way. And my short form writing is probably one of my weakest skill sets that I have. I am not a good short form writer, which means I try to, as much as I can, put more leverage into graphics and stuff like that and try to get those to pull more weight than my short form writing. And as a result, in any given case, no matter what my confidence is with something, it is quite often that people will interpret things very different than either what I intended or what I expected. In many cases, they will do precisely as I expected, but in some roundabout way I didn't expect. So I am finishing a 2-year, it's just about 2 years since inception campaign. And it is a 5th edition D&D campaign that went from level, I believe, 15, and we are currently at level... Let's see, we got 1 level after Yellowbeard, didn't we? No, before Yellowbeard. H down. We're on our 3rd level, I think. So we're level 17 or 18, I believe, something like that. Anyways, so 5th edition D&D, for those of you who are not familiar, it is basically a tabletop system built for people who use phones. It's for the phone generation. It's very, very, very simple, dumbed down. And they've stripped as much as they can out of it and injected a lot of diversity inserts in their official material. I basically never reference official material for anything other than rulings, spells, and stuff like that. It's custom worlds, custom environment. I've homebrewed a whole ton of shit for it. And my players are a mix of experiences, with most of them having, at best, rudimentary experience with tabletop role-playing in general. And in my main campaign that has been going on for close to 5 years, I have 4 players. 2 of them are high experience, and 2 of them are mid or low experience. In this, Autumn Winds and the other 3 short adventures I ran prior, the Albion series, the same set of 5 players, where 1 is high experience, 2 are low experience, 1 is very little experience, and the other has experience with like 4th edition and not much role playing. So it's very different people, most of which you don't know each other at all, really. They're acquainted with each other at best. And the different age groups as well. Different age groups. And the most interesting takeaway I get that I can apply to my other projects is just how people choose. Like with D&D, it's a player initiative. Usually in a digital game, you will never have true role playing because you will never be able to make your own initiative. You can hand somebody 20, 30 options about what to do. It is still options that are pre-programmed into the product that the developer had to think of beforehand, which means that you had to sit down and let's say you're presented with an opponent of some nature who's confronting you in some manner. And you decide, okay, I want the players to be able to resolve this with non-combat solutions. And then I want them to be able to resolve it with combat solutions. And all these different potential sub-resolutions. Maybe your non-combat solution involves bribing them. Maybe it involves seducing them. Maybe it involves having somebody else seduce them. Maybe you have some tie-in to some other quest or events in the rest of the game that drives some solution. Maybe you found out his brother is actually a cocaine addict and you can help him with his brother, and that leads you to a non-combat solution. Maybe your combat solution involves everything from trying to get the jump on him to trying to intimidate him to maybe, again, conditionally dependent, you have an army with you and that leads to its own thing. Whatever it is, it's something you had to program ahead of time. You had to decide ahead of time what these solutions are and what the conditions are to be able to reach them. And then maybe if you're extra high tier developer, you throw in random chance to do something. We got to leave it to the dice. And that's another thing I want to talk about too with dice, but we'll leave that for a second. The players have successfully many times managed to surprise me with the strange approaches they take to things, or the things that tend to draw their attention the most, or the things that give them the most pause. And a part of contributing factor of this is that although we tend to play a session every week, it is still an inconsistent playtime for exposing certain content, because some of the content in this, you do have to really pay attention. I try not to be overtly obvious with certain solutions unless I really think they're not going to get it. And there's most certainly a lot of cases they didn't really get certain things. And on that note, the other thing in regards to this that really ties into it is I find puzzles really difficult to make. I'm not a puzzle person. I don't enjoy puzzles. I think that if you're going to have a puzzle, it should be integrated into the actual core mechanics of the game. For example, a puzzle maybe outsmarting an opponent. That to me is puzzle enough. If we take a break from something, it tends to be a big disaster. Either it's too trivial or it's too obscure. It's sequenced through obscurity, as most puzzles. Well, in some portions of this campaign, I decided I wanted to have some non-combat interactivity, some navigational related stuff. Like Doom and colored doors and keys was a core theme of it, and then traps and certain stuff like that. And so there is a room, and it'll be referred to as the crank room. There's 4 cranks in this room that appear when you do something else in this church. And the cranks are not actually attached to anything. They don't do anything. You need to fill a bunch of these jugs with alcohol. And they all smell like alcohol. That's the read for that, to put alcohol in them. And then that activates a 5th crank that actually gets you where you want to go. So when the players first went through this area, they picked up one of the jugs and then left they didn't look at the other ones at all. And then they left this area and they didn't come back for a long time. They, at some point, determined that the jug was magical, and the magic changes when you put alcohol into it. But nothing happens because they required the other jugs. And then it kind of sort of just got forgotten about. And then they came back, and to make a long story short, they probably spent, 7-8 hours real time fucking around with cranks across the game, trying to get something to happen in this room. And many times they went by these other jugs to investigate them, and I would tell them each and every single time it smells like alcohol. But they glued onto this one jug that made a magical reaction and never thought to put alcohol in the other jugs. There wasn't anything that really separated them. It was just the way that they interacted with that first jug. And in fact, that experience was separated from what would amount to the rest of the interactions. It just didn't really quite put two and two together. And eventually, through metagaming rules, I decided I was going to have an NPC start directing them to these jugs. And I had to do that several times before I had to pretty much flat up tell them that the jugs were the same. And then then finally, like the funny thing about this is that one of the players will repeatedly state, maybe you should put alcohol in the other jugs, but they just never actually sat down and did it. And this, what I felt to be at the time, an extremely simple little puzzle, very simple, that chewed more of their time than pretty much any other equivalent in the game combined. It was, I felt like that if I didn't tell them this, they could have been there for many more hours yet, even after they determined that the cranks don't actually do it. It's really funny, but at the same time, it's also like you look back at that and you wonder, how the hell did this happen? Are people just smooth brains? There's more to it. It's how the information was absorbed. It's how they first took the first jug, how that was first resolved in a different area. And then the other jugs got to disconnect. And people come to their own conclusions. People come to their own conclusions completely independent of anything you handed to them. Because you can't straight up tell them what this does. So they have to put things together. And if you string out information in such a way where it tells them what it is, it's not really too much of a puzzle. But if it's too vague, then they'll never get it. And they'll just be complete random chance shooting in the dark. And this, I avoid puzzles for this exact interaction. But when I put in something that I thought would be really simple, it turns out it's not very simple. Well, it all just came down to how they consumed information. And that D&D really opened me. Like, that was one of the most, I've been running the game for like 4 years at that point. And this was my first real exploration into this kind of thing. And it was just, in those 4 years, it was like, holy shit. This is really out there. I never really expected this kind of interaction at all. It was really eye-opening. And even to this day, I still kind of look at that. And it's one of the things you really want to sit down and think about and look at all the other examples. You got to think about reads. This is reads, is what it is. When you think about a modern real-time example, this is reads. How is information processed by players? It is going to be very different than what you expect. Even the players who were super experienced with D&D, that played probably hundreds of games, thousands of hours worth, far longer than me, across many different GMs and many different platforms, we're all confounded by this. And it is something very simple. And at that point, it wasn't an experience thing. It was just how the data was presented. D&D is really about information management and information consumption. And that's my hugest takeaway from it, is how information gets processed is really going to be very much unlike, especially when you just got the text and the little images. It is so much more complicated than I really expected it to be.
So how do you reckon the dice themselves actually figure into this? Because I've gone back and forth on dice in a pen and paper context, but I'd never liked RNG in a game. Mm-hmm. And I guess this is part of my fixation on the idea that games ought to be or are best when they are competitive disciplines that I can seek self-improvement through, a vector for me to become better and also to seek out greater challenge and eventually triumph over that if I can prove that I'm good enough. And obviously any dice roll can't be accounted in when you're assessing skill. But in D&D, it's obviously very different. And I've heard you describe it before as a storytelling device. Could you expound on that and how that has changed your thought process over the years? Because like you mentioned, you've been running games for years now. So how would you say your opinion and your usage of dice has evolved over time?
First and foremost, if I had a system in place where I could get these players into a non-dice driven platform and transfer all this stuff, my God, I would do it in a heartbeat. So I am absolutely with you in that RNG has no place in games at all, unless it's some kind of behavioral driven mechanism like what an AI decides to do, or within reason, of course, but in generally speaking, there should be no randomness behind player-driven activities. So I certainly did not expect to be in the position I am today when I got into D&D so long ago. It was just sort of happenstance that brought me into this, and people kind of pressured me to make my own game because I was giving them ideas for stuff, and then they were like, "Oh, just go make your own game." And I was really resistant to it for a long time, and Dice is really one of the main reasons why. Dice was, when I talked about RNG to the person who brought me into this, and then the Dice, and read about it superficially, that's where they presented Dice as a storytelling mechanism. And the example given was a knight attacks you, and he seems like he's just general run-of-the-mill greenhorn, and then he starts performing really well in combat with his rolls. Well, it turns out he's actually got some skill, got some talent behind him. The dice have brought you those circumstances, now it's you as the DM to turn those circumstances into a story, into the events. The dice are the arbitrator. They're the ones who ultimately decide the results of any given thing. If someone rolls a natural 20, it's always a hit. It's going to always hit. So even if your opponent has, say for example, higher armor value, armor class, then your attack can actually hit, but you roll in that 20, you're still going to hit them. And as the DM, now it's your job to resolve how exactly this happens. Was it a fluke? Did you suddenly see an opening? In other words, yes, the dice do drive your storytelling, but in many cases, dice have proven to be an absolute mess. And now I've said I'm working with 5th edition, and 5th edition has really stripped out a lot of player customization and general freedom that the players had, and not really replaced it with anything besides, at best, vagueness. There is so little knowledge on how to handle many things and so few official rulings, you end up ultimately making up most of the game as you go along. And how to deal with certain spell effects and stuff like that is amongst it. There's a lot of stuff that's just left completely vague. And how exactly you decide to resolve certain stuff in the game is also sort of in your hands. Now, as a DM, of course, it makes sense. You can always choose to divert from any established conventions to begin with as well, which I've had to do more often than not. But as a system, it really doesn't give you that much to go by. So really all I've really gone off is the examples that I was given when I was first beginning. And they were examples of someone who was well experienced. So I think I had a good starting point, a good jumping pad to start with. But at the end of the day, dice are a damn disaster. Now, I think with many people who play this, they can roll off dice. D&D is traditionally seen as like a dungeon crawling, mechanics-oriented test. And you're going to see, what I've seen anyways, is that there's a divide that's formed between them and apparently a newer generation, I guess with 5th edition, of the phone users who come with 5th edition that are averse to gameplay, really, is really what I would say, is they're averse to gameplay. Kind of like the same people who think that spawning automated attack waves every 15 minutes makes for good RTS gameplay, is people who, well, they say that there are people who play for storytelling and for cinematic gameplay over like dungeon crawling. And therefore you see a lot more leniency with the way the dice are handled in newer groups. I have achieved both worlds. I have storytelling and world building and player exploration and all this stuff complete with people who are trying to min-max their builds. They're trying to be as strong as they can be. They're playing off of each other. I've got some Unearthed Arcana, which is beta stuff in here, stuff they've homebrewed, stuff I've homebrewed. We're really trying to push the bounds on that too. But dice are a fucking mess. It is honestly nearly impossible to balance around dice, and I find it really annoying. I've been able to make it work. I've been able to make endgame 5th edition work Thankfully, we don't have too many high-end spellcasters. I don't have to errata a whole bunch of spells. Suffice to say, I get rid of anything that's like save or dies because those are pretty stupid. But there is a lot of stuff that's basically make a save, or you're either put in a position where it's basically a game-ending position, like for an NPC, it may as well be instant death, or you're fucked. Like we have shit that'll imprison you for life. We have obviously Wish. We have Magic Jar, and a lot of other stuff like Power Word Kill and stuff like that, where you really just roll a dice. You rolled badly, well, that's that's it. Guess that's it. But we enter actually a very major point of contention. It's a long subject for sure. But when I got introduced into D&D, shortly after that, there was a person that I was introduced to. And she was a person with some experience in Pathfinder, which is older D&D, and another group who played Pathfinder. And she brought with her this mindset that you need to have high stats. Now, what high stats do in D&D is they basically pad your dice rolls. They give you a flat number on top of your dice rolls. So if you have plus 20 strength versus plus 10 strength, you have a plus 5 modifier. So if you roll 1d20 and you end up with a 10, if you have 0 strength, you got the 10. If you have 20 strength, you got 15. This pads the reliability of your rolls and makes your rolls more reliable. This person came with the obsession of having high modifiers because they hated combat. That was their excuse anyways. I think it was more of a power trip kind of thing myself. But hating combat was definitely a part of it. They wanted combat to end as fast as possible because they wanted to stick to the what they perceived to be the role-playing aspect. And whereas I always felt that it was a weakness on behalf of the players and the DM, if they couldn't turn combat into a role-playing experience, that's entirely on them because D&D is at least half about combat. Most of your stat block is based on combat. But you enter the problem where even in cases where you have high stats, because we would roll for stats in pretty much all these games, we would have people with very high stats and they would still roll like consistent shit. And the most basic things would fuck them over and over and over and over. And one of the things for phone edition D&D, 5th edition, that they've introduced is the concepts of disadvantage and advantage. What disadvantage is you roll 2 dice, 2d20. You take the lowest result. Advantage is you roll 2 and you take the highest result. This is, again, all about padding RNG. These systems are about trying to game a system of RNG named disadvantage and advantage, where you have an advantage in dice rolls or a disadvantage in dice rolls. Well, those dice will still, more often than you might think, roll 2 extremely unfavorable results, and it won't make a damn of a difference. And this leads obviously to a lot of salt. So in Autumn Winds, the campaign that's nearing its conclusion, we're on what is effectively the final encounter. In the first portion of this final encounter, the player fights this boss, and they're dying. They're wiping. And they're going to go running around this arena, opening up these prisons and freeing these little things. And along the way, they're going to take a few shots at this boss. And they're actually almost going to kill the first phase of this boss in a fight that they really weren't invested into. They weren't really fighting back that much on. They wipe, they come back, and then they're on the actual fight with this boss. And then they roll bad. Very bad. Very bad. And this dude, with like less than a quarter of his health left, just fucking obliterates them. He's got 2 people down. He's got 2 people paralyzed. The other person can't even do anything because he's out of range now. And they take so much from this fight. And you know what it is? It's all because of bad rolls. It's all because the dice just decided, today you're fucked. And this is with advantage. They roll advantage. They take advantage. They take the highest result of 2 over and over and over and over. They get fucked by it. And that is most often what actually happens to me as the DM, is my creatures will very often roll really badly. And the encounters will be, as a result, much more easy than I expected. The fight before this one, the party came in with very little resources, low health. And they didn't have too much. And they fight this dude who, statistically on paper, should just beat the ever-loving shit out of them, should wipe them with maybe 2 rounds, 3 rounds to go. they drop him before he even gets a chance to really do anything at all, because they just rolled consecutively high over and over and over and over again, which has also happened in cases where I've had a player run across a massive map with 20 units attacking him and multi-attack, and not a single one of them could hit him with a natural crit. I never rolled a nat 20 on him, not even once, over and over and over and over again. And irrespective of the platform you're playing on with like 5th edition or 3.5 or something like that, as far as I'm concerned, I've always been trained to despise RNG. And I've talked with a variety of players from a variety of backgrounds and a variety of experiences, some of which are obsessed with having those flat bonuses so they don't have to worry as much about dice. And a lot of people who get very salty about bad dice rolls, and a lot of people who just, they don't really care whether they live or die. To them, it's no real major investment. But at the end of the day, every single one of these players is enslaved to a system in which ultimately they don't have much of a say over. And it always feels bad for me to punish the party because something outside of both my and their control just decided, hey, your numbers are lower now. And then likewise, it always, feels kind of shitty for me. It's like, well, the player has got through this really just off luck. Like, it is ultimately luck. So I always try to go by that mindset of dice can be used for storytelling, and I've always played it as such. But inside, as a designer, I'm always like ripping out my hair and choking myself with it, because it's just like, say for example, these puzzles kinds of things. I always try to treat D&D as a way in which if the players can figure something else, something to do, like conversations is really one of the major ones. If they can talk their way around something or figure their way around something, I would prefer to reward them with success without ever having to roll a dice whatsoever. If I can get through something, some kind of encounter, some kind of situation without ever having to roll a dice, that to me is the perfect solution. Dice should really only ever enter the equation, or should feel like they ever have to enter the equation where there's some really major contest that can't be just resolved through just talking your way out of it. And a lot of the times with the puzzles, it comes to people trying to assess how something works, trying to figure out how something works, trying to investigate something. A dice has to be called for this. And unless it's something that really should just make sense with like passive perception or whatever. And there is a extreme consistency of people rolling like absolute shit in a lot of these cases. And one thing that a DM normally shouldn't let you do is make repeated attempts at rolling to figure something else. Figure something else out. Oh, I failed to figure out, to look at this thing. Can I just roll again? Normally you would never be allowed to do that. But what will happen is somebody will fail at a roll. And another person will be like, well, can I give it a try? And I'm like, well, it is a different person, right? You may as well give them a shot. And then they will roll bats. And then someone else will come in. And then they'll roll. And we'll go through the entire fucking party. They all rolled below 10. That's that. Whatever it was, there isn't like a realistic way of rules is written that I should give it to them. And that always feels like shit, right? Especially when you're in like a high-level game. They have high-level mods. They just roll like garbage the entire fucking time. And then at that point, you kind of maybe got to step out and say, oh, maybe you figure this out. Or maybe they in ideal cases, they figure out some other approach that opens up the possibility for another attempt in some other angle that makes sense. But sometimes you either just got to say, you don't get this, or you figured out some other way to get it, or maybe an NPC might figure it out for them or something like that. But a lot of cases where it's like you are just playing on the fly. You're making the calls on the fly, and you don't usually have a lot of precedence on how to handle certain situations. And that comes up a lot, and you really have to improvise most of the game. Most of the game is improvised, and you don't really have time to really think about, is this the right decision? Am I doing this the right way? How does it feel for the players and stuff like that? So dice are definitely, at best, a very conflicting subject for me.
It's interesting that you brought up the case of like a non-combat area. I feel like, it's probably possible to do combat without dice, although it would be pretty involved. But it feels like it should be easier to do what you were describing with the whole idea of like analyzing something that maybe is analogous to a puzzle, where it feels like maybe the player, if like a player is playing as a character that has a lot of engineering background and they come up against a problem where they can use that character's know-how, then rather than doing a dice check, it would be like a history check or do you have the familiarity with the subject check? I don't know how many subjects you could theoretically sort of bifurcate in that way where
I
it's
have allowed
plausible
stuff
that-
like that. Yeah, like one of the players in On the Wind has a super high arcana, a super high intelligence, and I'm basically adopting a psionic system from my original writing into D&D, and there's like an abstraction between it because D&D is very simple and that system's very complex. But the way I viewed it is that this player gets to attempt a lot of things that otherwise would not normally be attemptable because this stat and this skill is very high. And likewise, again, skills may offer you a tool proficiency. I've also done that as well. I'm really not out to like fight the players and stuff. If they have something that I feel like is going to fit a certain category, or if they're really probing for something in a certain way, I may allow them to do something which otherwise normally would not be, rules as written allowed. Like, I'm trying to think of examples, but honestly, is far and beyond. But like trying to sense out certain things with your mind, for example, is one of those very arcane sort of abstract things. It's like this doesn't normally exist in D&D. You don't normally have the DBZ power level sense. That doesn't normally exist, but it's something I kind of brought in early because it was something that existed in my psionic system. So I may call for Arcana, which is intellect, or Perception, which is wisdom, depending on the circumstance and depending on the character and depending on how they're going to probe around it. Or in many cases, I actually give them a choice of which one they want. And that choice just ends up being arbitrary in the sense of how I feel like something should be applied. And they, as a character, can apply whatever skill feels most valuable to them in that sense. But that also comes as a sense of something I've brought up as an example many times before, is that, especially with 5th edition, the way that the attributes and stuff is distributed is very awkward at times. Like intimidation is really the big one I like to go to because, again, intimidation can be done in so many different ways. But you are strapped to this one attribute for this, and it doesn't make sense for a lot of potential cases. So I try to offer those options. So I guess in many ways you might consider me a very lenient DM in that way.
Do you think that there's room for, so you were describing earlier that if you when I first brought up the subject of dice, you mentioned that like if you could remove it and just get players to adopt a system that doesn't have dice involved, you would do it because dice just have so many different drawbacks. And I think you've quite articulately illustrated a bunch of them where you were talking about cases where they failed rolls and that just changed their whole game plan and threw everything in the shitter. This is slated, if I'm not mistaken, to be your last game as a DM. Is there something that would draw you back into the prospect of making one? If you were to explore the idea of removing dice from the equation or minimizing their impact, would that make it more compelling for you to potentially do another one? Or are there other more deeper personal reasons for deciding to move on from D&D?
Well, I'm still going to be running the main campaign until that's finished. I don't know. It could be long running, but as far as new projects are concerned, yes, it will be my last. There is a lot of historical angst and grudge with D&D as a platform that really killed a lot of my interest in it. The initial group I had dealings with turned out to be extremely toxic. And the resulting interactions from them and the gaslighting that they performed really, really destroyed my interest in the subject altogether. And honestly, I don't think that short form writing is my thing. I don't think I do very well in it. In order for me to come back to it after this, beyond the main campaign, it would be dramatic. I don't think I would really do it unless the whole thing was different. Like I don't even want to play it anymore, to be honest. I used to enjoy it a lot too, but again, some experiences I have a hard time letting go of the things that happen. And when I come out of these projects, one of the things about projects is I always feel like real shit coming out of them. And I never really am quite happy or even really content with the stuff I built. And Autumn Wind is the 2 years that Autumn Wind has been active. It's been the worst years of my life by a long shot. So many horrible things have happened. But there's a lot of times where I wasn't backlogged by this stuff, and I still ended up not really making things work out well in this game. And I just think that medium and well, in general, just doesn't work that well for me. I would say I did more consistently than with any other project, and I was able to keep up with the sessions and stuff like that. But I feel like it is still something that doesn't work well for me. I do not feel like I did a good job as a DM. I think I've long reached the limit of what I can accomplish with it. Um, we were hoping to have a custom client built in Unreal 4 or Unreal 5 that would allow us to escape the confines of the insanity that is the Roll20 platform and other related platforms they're all terrible, really. But there was a lot of logistical issues with those, and HKS ran into a lot of problems with them. So it's really not gone anywhere. Hopefully, maybe Unreal 5 will give us an option to explore that more in depth with the main campaign. But I feel like even with that, the platform really won't exist where I can make what skills I have shine. I am much better at script writing, long form writing, and building. Hard to really put into words, but basically writing out short blurbs of text and firing is really, I don't really work that well with that, especially under pressure. As a DM, I've got 5 different people running around in 5 different directions. I've got 20, 30 other units. I'm trying to manage all the stat blocks and numbers and transitioning maps, and fighting the actual software itself is always a hassle. I do not write well in the circumstances of general person-to-person dialogue. I'm not really good at short-form communication in general. So when it comes to doing it in D&D, I don't do it too well at all. I definitely couldn't do, for example, most people play D&D either in person or with voice chat. I never could do that at all. I do this exclusively through text. I would never change that. And even then, it's still, I don't think it really quite syncs up. So I think that just in general, the whole process doesn't really work that well for me. It would need a change, a platform that changes. Well, it's actually really hard to put into words. Changes the very approach, the very way you present information, which would ultimately mean much more preparation, labor. Effectively like building a game, but you're governing it as it plays. At the end of the day, I feel like, well, why not just make a game, right? The kind of things I would like to explore if given the opportunity outside of D&D is really sort of applying the lessons I learned from it to other projects. Like the ARPG project is one, but any other potential future explorations. And that's why I say one of the main takeaways I take from D&D is how people process information, what they do with that information, how they approach certain challenges, and how completely different it is. Particularly since they're given the option to be completely different. It's not something I programmed. I sometimes hand them the weirdest shit, and the things they do with it is really bizarre. This party, for example, has a fetish with drop kicking doors, and if there's doors they cannot drop kick them, they've used the reduce spell on them and destroyed them. So there's been a lot of obsession with drop kicking stuff as a result in this, in places that are just completely incomprehensible, and I had to think, what the fuck happens? Like, they were inside this church, they were in the depths, and behind this wall there's these huge hearts that are giving life to the church, and they're inside this corridor in the dead end, and one of the players is like, I'm gonna drop kick this. And I'm like, you got a guy who's pure muscle, he's gonna drop kick this wall that's next to this heart, and I'm like, nothing's going to happen to the wall because this wall is fortified, like effectively concrete. But wouldn't, like, you have this living organism behind the wall, wouldn't it potentially feel vibrations? Wouldn't there be a response for that? And I got to figure out what we're going to do on that spot because the players are going to be out of here within a few seconds. I'm going to roll perception on this. Well, that's a nat 20. The heart rolls a nat 20 on perception and knows something weird is going on there. Has to be some kind of response. Suddenly we had an interaction here that was never foreseen, never pre-programmed, never anything. Just because the player decided to do something I never thought they would do there. Why would he do that? Just out of frustration? In character? Damn this dead end. There's nothing here. I went all this distance through all this danger. There's nothing here. I guess I'll just drop kick this wall. So it really... I mean, when I'm designing something like StarCraft projects, total conversions, I'm going through all these build orders and these units and stuff like that. I've always tried to see things as how people might try to use stuff. I always try to look at the potentials. But when you give people the potential that has no limits, you end up in bizarre. just the bizarre circumstances. And that I have no problems dealing with. I feel like my improvisation play improved a lot over the last 5 years, but I'm never really quite content with the quality of my writing, the consistency of my presentation. I've also had difficulties even processing the own information and data I've prepared for myself. I've missed a lot of stuff, failed to call a lot of things, failed to rule a lot of things as I should have, and that has impacted game performance, and it always feels terrible. I mean, at the end of the day, this is transparent to the players. They don't know, in most cases, that I've fucked up something really badly. I've usually been able to roll off of a lot of mistakes, which is most certainly a skill of DMing, but it always feels bad to do that because I feel like the experience could have been a lot better if I was really able to take advantage of my skill sets. I think at some point you have to acknowledge that you want to play to your strengths, and if you've tried for 5 years and you can't really get strengths out of this platform, it may not be the platform for you. I mean, I'm prone to flights of fancy. Maybe something will change down the line, but that is most certainly how I view it now. Is I want to take a very long, extended break from that.
Okay, well, I think we've covered a huge amount of ground. It's probably a good place to wind us down. I wanted to ask if you had any thoughts about sort of you've come a long way. You've done a lot of things. Your back catalog. We didn't even touch on like video production and stuff, which is a pretty big subject in and of itself. But you've done so many things so far. You did mention you weren't really particularly content with the outcome of some of the projects that you've done. If I could pose one final question for you, I think it would be what means that you are content with the work that you're doing, for example, in this Unreal project? Or like at the end of the day, you said you're going to take a break from the D&D stuff, right? So like what would make a content Mesk by the end of some of these things that are currently underway? How do you come away with it? Like if I sat you down in like a couple months or a year or however long it takes to finish some of these things, and you came to me and said, I'm content, I'm happy, this worked out well. Like, what does that look like for the ARPG, for example?
With a D&D project, it would be if all 5 of the players walked out of it feeling really good, I think. I mean, I will always feel shitty about that project, but ultimately I'm not making the project for myself. So if all 5 players came out feeling that it was well polished and exceeded the expectations and improved from the past projects, then ultimately I'd be okay with that. I would still feel bitter about the project. With the ARPG, that's more complex. Obviously, when you're looking at a project like this, even though I'm saying remove all the fluff and just focus on these one things, to get those things correct is the work of multiple individuals with experience in the field. And I have a lot of experience, but that's modding experience. And modding experience doesn't apply to game design. It doesn't even come close. They're pretty much incomparable. Certain things you will pick up along the way may help you, like with D&D, I learned a lot about doctoring images. I'm really good at tidying stuff up, removing watermarks, removing noise, cleaning up images. I've got Waifu 2x upscaler for helping noise removal and know how to take results out of that or prepare results for it. And updating information. So when I port assets from whatever to bring into Unreal 4 or Unreal 5, I know how to modernize this stuff. I know how to bring it into PBR and to make it look at least reasonably consistent. And I have that feeling, that instinct, that intuition for what makes for like good rays, good synthesis between all the elements. And I know how things should feel to play and what makes fair and what unfair. But you're still talking about a platform that you're not really prepared for. I have been brushing shoulders with programming and programmers ever since I began this journey decades ago. And I am the furthest thing from a programmer. And getting into programming has been a long time ambition of mine. I wanted to get into Uscript and use C++ and then C and stuff like that. I wanted to get into this stuff because that's what I needed to make my projects happen. I've always been afraid of it. Well, that was a kick in 2019 that got me started down this, and I got into Blueprints, which is like Visual C++, and object oriented and all this other shit. I know, but that's what I'm working with. And even so, it's been challenging. Like I did stuff with a little bit with some of them. You would say basic stuff like arrays and stuff in Warcraft 3 with my maps and projects for that. I still found that I find the concepts kind of difficult to get into. A lot of people have told me that my mindset and my methodology would work well for programming, but my experience, it tends to be the opposite. I might think of things logically, but I have a really hard time wrapping around how information and stuff actually works in programming. And I just started getting back into Unreal 4 now after having to really focus on D&D because of all the stuff that happened last year. And I pretty much forgot everything I knew. So it was really rough getting back into stuff. And HKS was trying to explain to me the difference between pure and impure and the way the data is sort of handled. And it's just, he had to explain it like 6-7 fucking times before I even started to understand it. And I still don't really understand it. So it's hard to look at a project like that and see the end of the road. And see an end of the road you can actually feel good about. But I already feel good about that project because when I first started, in a month, I had this character from World of Warcraft in the game with animations that I had taken out and put into 3ds Max, and I had hand keyframed in 3ds Max and adjusted. I had an AI that can navigate ledges, something that, as I said, as everybody has seen, so few games even have. Multi-billion dollar companies can't figure out how, or care to figure out how to make enemies navigate a fucking ledge. I had that in within a month. And I just walked in and did it within a couple days, just following a video on YouTube. It's the simplest, dumbest thing. But to sit down and interact it, and that's what gets me going, is seeing that I built this, I got this working. It was knowledge that I put together, and especially with the learning disabilities and pussyfooting around the thing for so many years, being actually sit down and do it. That is something I will always feel good about. I always look back to that and say, I did this. I sat down and I did this. And the project as a whole, I think a point of contentitude would be to have this model or a model, if we ever change again, something at some point where I can look at it and I can see there are not really any major flaws with it. And I have the reads down and the movesets down and the basic visuals down, stuff I've proven that I can do in my previous projects to myself. I know what I can do with this stuff. I know that I'm good with this stuff. I know I can make it work. If I can get to the point that I can rely on my strengths rather than trying to strengthen my weaknesses, then I think that will be a point that I can be content, because as a rule of thumb, when I'm in development, I focus on what's most difficult first. And with this, that's the character model, it's the character controls, it's going to be the camera, it's going to be the AI, it's going to be learning stuff that I have no experience in, that I've never been prepared for in all my years of working with content. And then when I am good at that and I can lean on my strengths, then I will seek to improve my strengths. And then I think at that point, we'll reach a stage where I can say, I'm content with this project. Will I be able to finish the project? Realistically speaking, no. Realistically speaking, my life is too much of a disaster to even hope to have the time or freedom to really put serious effort into this. But if I can get to a stage where I can feel like I improved as a person, my skill sets reach the stage where I can feel like I can play this and I feel like I'm having an interacting experience with it. If I can reach out and grab those experiences I had in the previous projects I am using as a driving force for this, and I can say I am replicating that, then I will be content.
Thank you very much for sitting down and talking with me for 3 hours, as is customary in our lives. So yeah, it's I think there's more people than you know are rooting for you to succeed, even if it is a very personal thing, and even if it doesn't get distributed widely or anything like that. Which I know you have different, plans. Mm-hmm. The average person, if they're working on a game, they're probably thinking about releasing it far and wide and trying to get as much of a revenue.
I just said I'm using ports. I couldn't release this even if I wanted to.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's your approach is very different. You are a very unique individual and developer in that respect. And I think just by virtue of the fact that you are going a different direction, there's a lot of value in you finding success. So I certainly wish you all the luck. And once again, thanks for your time.
Well, thanks for having me.